Hello there, everyone. Welcome to Nightmare Narratives. I am your storyteller, and I'm here to guide you tonight. I know many of you use these videos to drift off to sleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. I'm always curious. Where are you watching from, and what time is it in your part of the world? Now, find your cozy spot and relax.
My name is Daniel Wolfe. I'm 40 years old, and I've spent most of my life in the forests of Washington state. For 15 years, I worked as a logger, cutting down trees that had stood for centuries. Back then, I didn't think much about it. It was just a job, a way to put food on the table and pay the bills. But something changed in me over time. I started to see the forest differently, not just as a resource, but as something alive. Something worth protecting. That's why I became a park ranger. Now I spend my days patrolling the Olympic National Forest, one of the last untouched places in the country. It's beautiful here. Ancient trees towering hundreds of feet into the sky, moss blanketing every surface, and a mist that never seems to lift. It feels like stepping into another world, one where time moves slower and nature still rules. But lately something hasn't felt right. The forest is changing. It started a few months ago when I noticed strange patterns in the plant growth. Moss and fungi were spreading in ways I'd never seen before, forming shapes that almost looked deliberate. Circles, spirals, even symbols I couldn't recognize. Vines with bright flowers started appearing in places they shouldn't exist. Flowers I couldn't find in any guidebook. And then there were the sounds, bird calls that stopped suddenly, insect noises that came in strange rhythms like they were trying to send a message. At first I thought it was just my imagination or maybe some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But then I started hearing stories from locals, hunters and hikers who swore they felt like they were being watched out there. Some even claimed they saw animals acting strange. Wolves and deer working together like they were part of some coordinated plan. And then there are the legends. My mother was Kino, part of one of the indigenous tribes native to this area. She used to tell me stories about tree spirits and forest guardians, beings that protected sacred places from harm. As a kid, I thought they were just bedtime stories meant to scare me into behaving. But now I'm not so sure. A few weeks ago, a logging company called Northwest Timber got a permit to cut down trees in one of the old-growth sections of the forest, a place that had been off-limits for decades. I fought hard against it, but money talks louder than a park ranger's protests. They sent a team out there last week to start work, 12 men, including my son Tyler. I haven't spoken to Tyler much since he took that job with Northwest Timber. He doesn't understand why I left logging or why I care so much about saving these trees. To him, it's just wood, a paycheck waiting to be cashed. We've been distant ever since my divorce from his mother. She couldn't handle my career, change, or the pay cut that came with it. Still, when Tyler told me he'd be part of this crew, something inside me twisted up with worry. Maybe it was guilt for all those years I spent cutting down trees myself, or maybe it was something else, something deeper. Yesterday we lost contact with their camp. A storm rolled in out of nowhere, thunder so loud it shook my cabin and rain, so heavy it turned the trails into rivers of mud. When things finally cleared up this morning, we still hadn't heard from them. No radio calls, no reports, nothing. That's why I'm here now, standing at the edge of the Hoh rainforest with two other rangers, Parker and Littleton, preparing to head into one of the most remote sections of this forest to find out what happened. The air feels heavy here, like it's pressing down on us. The trees are so dense that barely any light gets through their canopy, casting everything in shades of green and gray. As we step onto the trail leading toward the logging camp, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. I tell myself, it's just nerves, that everything will make sense once we get there, but deep down I know better. Something is wrong with this forest, and whatever it is, It's waiting for us. As we made our way deeper into the forest, I couldn't help but think about how I ended up here. It wasn't an easy road, and honestly, I'm still figuring things out. 15 years as a logger leaves its mark on you. I used to be proud of the work, cutting down trees, clearing land, helping build homes and towns. It felt like honest labor, but over time, it started to feel wrong. I remember the first time I saw one of those massive old-growth trees come down. It was over 300 feet tall and probably older than this country itself. The sound it made when it hit the ground was like a thunderclap, and for some reason, it made my stomach turn. I didn't quit right away. I told myself it was just part of the job, nothing personal. But the guilt grew heavier with every tree I cut down. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So, I walked away from logging and started over as a park ranger. It wasn't easy. Less money, fewer friends, and a lot of people who thought I'd lost my mind. My son Tyler was one of them. He was just a kid when I made the switch, but even then he didn't understand why his dad would give up a good-paying job to save trees. As he got older, he followed in my footsteps. Not as a ranger, but as a logger. It felt like a slap in the face at first, but I knew it wasn't personal. He was just trying to find his own path. Still, it's hard not to feel like I failed him somehow. "Wolf," Parker called out from up ahead, snapping me out of my thoughts. "You see this?" I hurried over to where he was standing and saw what he meant. The trail ahead was completely blocked by fallen trees, huge ones that looked like they'd been uprooted by the storm. But something about it didn't sit right with me. "These didn't fall naturally," I said after a moment. "Look at the roots. They're too clean. It's like they were pulled out of the ground." Littleton frowned as she examined one. "Of the trunks." "By what? A tornado?" I shook my head. "No tornadoes around here." We had no choice but to climb over the mess and keep moving. The deeper we went, the stranger things got. The plants seemed off somehow. Vines twisted around tree trunks in unnatural patterns, and patches of moss formed shapes that looked almost deliberate, circles and spirals that reminded me of old carvings I'd seen in museums. "Does this look normal to you?" Littleton asked, pointing at a cluster of flowers growing along the trail. I knelt down for a closer look. They were bright red, with petals shaped like tiny hands, something I'd never seen before in all my years out here. "No," I admitted quietly. "It doesn't." Parker chuckled nervously behind me. "Maybe we've discovered a new species. Or maybe we shouldn't be here," Littleton muttered under her breath. I didn't say anything, but her words stuck with me as we pressed on toward the logging camp. The controversy surrounding this logging operation had been brewing for months before they even set foot in the forest. Northwest Timber had been trying to get access to this section for years, claiming it was essential for their business. The area was home to some of the oldest trees in the region, trees that had stood untouched for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. I fought hard against their permit application, arguing that this place was too important to destroy. The Kinol tribe joined me in protesting. They said this land was sacred and warned that disturbing it could have serious consequences. But money talks louder than tradition or conservation these days. The company finally got their permit after promising to follow strict environmental guidelines and leave certain heritage trees untouched. My job was to make sure they kept their word, a task that put me directly at odds with my former colleagues in the logging industry. The tension had been building ever since they arrived last week. Equipment kept breaking down for no apparent reason. Workers reported feeling uneasy, like they were being watched, and there were rumors about animals behaving strangely near the camp. I'd heard enough stories from indigenous elders over the years to know better than to dismiss these things outright. Elder Joseph, a respected figure in the Quinault community, had warned me personally about what might happen if we let Northwest Timber into this part of the forest. "They'll awaken something that should stay asleep," he told me during one of our conversations at their protest camp near the forest's edge. What do you mean? I asked him. He looked at me with eyes full of worry and said only one thing: the one who walks through trees. At the time, I thought it was just another story meant to scare people away from logging here. But now I wasn't so sure. When we finally reached what should have been the logging camp, all three of us stopped dead in our tracks. The clearing where their equipment had been set up was empty. No trucks, no tents, no sign of life at all, except for half-eaten meals scattered across makeshift tables, like everyone had left in a hurry. "What the hell happened here?" Parker whispered. Before I could answer him, something caught my eye. A tree near the edge of the clearing with deep gouges in its bark that looked almost like claw marks or teeth marks. And then there was the smell, a sickly sweet scent mixed with something metallic that turned my stomach. "This isn't right," Littleton said softly, as she scanned our surroundings with wide eyes. She was right. It wasn't right at all. Something had happened here. Something bad, and whatever it wasn't over yet. The clearing was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our own breathing. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Where is everyone?" Parker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know. The camp looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Plates of food sat on tables, half-eaten. A coffee pot was still steaming, which meant they hadn't been gone long. But there was no sign of struggle, no footprints leading away, no blood, nothing. Littleton knelt by one of the tables and picked up a fork. "It's still warm," she said. Holding it up like that explained anything. I walked to the center of the clearing, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. Something about this place felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier here. My eyes scanned the area, looking for any clue as to what might have happened. That's when I saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, there was a tree with something embedded in its bark. At first, I thought it was just a strange knot or maybe some kind of fungus. But as I got closer, I realized what it really was. Teeth. Human teeth. They were stuck in the bark like someone or something had bitten into the tree and left them behind. The gums were still attached, and there was fresh blood dripping down the trunk. What is that?" Littleton asked from behind me, her voice shaking. I didn't answer right away. My stomach churned as I reached out to touch the tree, half expecting it to move under my hand. The bark felt warm, too warm, and sticky with sap that smelled faintly like iron. "I don't know," I finally said, pulling my hand back quickly. Parker joined us, his face pale as he stared at the teeth. "This is messed up," he muttered. "We need to call this in." He reached for his radio, but all we got was static. The storm must have knocked out the signal towers, or maybe it was something else entirely. "We'll try again when we're out of this section," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "For now, let's keep looking." Neither of them looked happy about it, but they nodded and followed me as we moved deeper into the forest. The trail leading away from the camp was barely visible under a tangle of vines that hadn't been there before. They were thick and covered in thorns that glistened like they were wet with dew or blood. We had to hack our way through with machetes just to make progress. As we walked, I noticed more strange things about the forest around us. The trees seemed closer together than they should have been, their branches twisting toward each other like they were trying to block out the sky. The ground was soft and spongy underfoot, and every step felt like it might sink us deeper into the earth. And then there were the shapes. At first, I thought they were just shadows cast by the trees, the kind you see out of the corner of your eye but can never quite focus on. But as we moved further along the trail, I started to realize they weren't shadows at all. They were figures, tall and thin with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as they moved between the trees. They stayed just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on us. "Do you see that?" Littleton whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our footsteps. I nodded without looking at her. "Keep moving," I said quietly. "Don't stop." Parker glanced over his shoulder nervously. What are they? I don't know, I admitted. But whatever they are, they're watching us. We finally reached another clearing after what felt like hours of walking. This one was smaller than the first, but just as unsettling. In the center stood a single tree, a massive cedar with a trunk so wide it would take 3 people holding hands to wrap around it. But what caught my attention wasn't its size, it was what was growing on it. Dozens of flowers covered its bark, bright red ones like we'd seen earlier on the trail. But these weren't shaped like hands anymore. They were shaped like faces, human faces, with hollow eyes and mouths frozen in silent screams. Littleton gagged when she saw them and turned away quickly. Even Parker looked like he might be sick. "What is this place?" he asked quietly. I didn't have an answer for him, because I didn't know either. All I knew was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. But just as I turned to leave, something caught my eye near the base of the tree, a hand sticking out from under a pile of leaves and vines. "Over here!" I called out, rushing toward it. The others followed me as I started pulling away the foliage, revealing more of what lay beneath. A body tangled in roots that had grown through its limbs like they were part of it now. The face was barely recognizable, but I knew who it was anyway. Matthews, one of Tyler's co-workers from Northwest Timber. His eyes were open but lifeless, staring up at nothing while his mouth hung slack in a silent scream. Parker took a step, back, his hand covering his mouth as he tried not to throw up. Littleton just stood there, frozen in shock. "We need to go," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Now." I nodded and stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my pants, even though they still felt dirty somehow. But before we could take another step, we heard it. A low rumble coming from deep within the forest that made every hair on my body stand on. And it wasn't thunder or wind or anything natural. It sounded alive and angry, and it was getting closer. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before. A deep rumble that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through the soles of my boots. It wasn't constant, it came in waves, growing louder and then fading slightly like it was breathing. "What is that?" Parker asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that we needed to move, and fast. "Stay together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "No matter what happens, don't split up." We turned back toward the trail we'd come from, but it wasn't there anymore. The vines had grown thicker while we were in the clearing, twisting together into an impenetrable wall of thorns. It was like the forest had closed itself off behind us. Littleton pulled out her machete and started hacking at the vines, but they didn't budge. Every time she cut one, another grew in its place almost instantly. "It's like it's alive," she muttered, her voice shaking. "It is alive," I said quietly, "and it doesn't want us to leave." We had no choice but to find another way out. The rumbling sound followed us as we moved deeper into the forest, growing louder with every step. It felt like whatever was making it was circling us, closing in slowly but deliberately. The trees seemed to shift around us as we walked, their trunks leaning closer together until the path ahead was barely wide enough for one person at a time. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened until it felt like we were walking through clouds. "Do you hear that?" Parker asked suddenly. I stopped and listened. At first I thought it was just the rumbling again, but then I realized it was something else, something softer but just as unsettling. Footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, echoing through the forest like someone or something was following us. But every time I turned around to look, there was nothing there. "Keep moving," I said firmly. "Don't stop." It wasn't long before Littleton disappeared. One moment she was right behind me, her flashlight cutting through the mist like a beacon. The next moment she was gone. No sound, no scream, just gone. "Littleton!" Parker shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he turned in circles trying to find her. "Stay calm," I said quickly, grabbing his arm to keep him from running off into the mist. "We'll find her." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. We retraced our steps as best we could, calling out her name every few seconds. The rumbling sound grew louder and more erratic now, like whatever was making it had noticed our panic and was feeding off of it. After what felt like hours of searching, we finally found her, or what was left of her. She was standing near a massive tree trunk with her back to us, completely still except for the slight movement of her head as she turned toward us slowly. Her face looked wrong somehow, pale and stretched tight over her skull like she hadn't eaten in days, and then I saw why. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the tree. Vines had grown through her arms and legs like veins, pulling her into its trunk until she was part of it now. Bark covered parts of her skin where flesh used to be, and leaves sprouted from her hair like they'd always been there. "Help me," she whispered weakly as tears streamed down her face. Parker froze in place beside me, his mouth opening and closing silently like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I stepped forward slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached out toward her, but before my hand could touch hers, she screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It sounded more like wind tearing through branches or animals crying out in pain all at once. Her eyes rolled back into her head as the tree pulled her deeper into its trunk until there was nothing left but bark where she'd been standing moments before. "We need to get out of here," Parker said urgently as he grabbed my arm again. "Now," I nodded and turned away from what used to be Littleton, because looking at it any longer would have broken me completely. But before we could take another step, something grabbed Parker's leg. He screamed as vines wrapped around his ankle and started pulling him toward another tree nearby, a smaller one this time, but just as alive as the others. He tried kicking at them with his free leg while shouting for help, but they were too strong. I didn't think, I just acted. Pulling out my knife from its sheath on my belt, I dropped to my knees beside him and started cutting at the vines as fast as I could. They hissed when my blade touched them like they were alive and angry, but eventually they loosened enough for Parker to pull free. His leg looked bad, deep cuts where the thorns had dug into his skin. But worse than that, part of it had started changing. The flesh near his ankle had turned hard and brown like bark, spreading up toward his knee, slowly but steadily. "It's spreading," he said quietly as he stared down at his leg with wide eyes full of fear. "We'll stop it," I promised him, even though I had no idea how. And no time to figure it out either, because the rumbling sound was closer now than ever before. Whatever was hunting us wasn't far away anymore. We didn't stop moving. Parker was limping badly, leaning on me for support, but we couldn't afford to rest. The forest felt alive now, watching, shifting, closing in around us. Every step felt harder than the last, like the ground itself was trying to hold us back. The rumbling had stopped, replaced by a new sound, something softer but far more terrifying. It was a creaking noise, like wood bending under pressure, mixed with the rustling of leaves. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees like a voice calling out to us. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, moving between the trees, too big to be an animal, but too fast to be anything else. It didn't make sense. One moment it was on our left, the next it was ahead of us, and then behind us, like it could be anywhere it wanted to be. "Do you see that?" Parker whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. My heart was pounding, so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The shadow stopped moving. It stood perfectly still in the distance, just barely visible through the mist, and then it stepped forward. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was something real, something alive. The creature stood at least 12 feet tall, its body made entirely of plants. Its arms were long and thin like tree branches, its legs thick and rooted like trunks. Moss covered its chest, and vines twisted around its limbs like muscles. Its face, if you could call it that, was a shifting mass of leaves and bark that formed into human-like features for just a moment before falling apart again. In the center of its chest was something glowing, a pulsating amber light that looked like sap dripping from a wound. It didn't move right away. It just stood there watching us with eyes that weren't really eyes at all, just hollow spaces in its face where light seemed to gather. What is that?" Parker stammered. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that this thing wasn't just part of the forest. It was the forest, and it wasn't happy we were here. The creature took a step toward us, and the ground shook beneath its weight. Its body creaked and groaned with every movement, like an ancient tree bending in the wind. The vines around its arms writhed like snakes, reaching out toward us as if they had minds of their own. "Run," I said quietly at first, then louder, when Parker didn't move. "Run!" We turned and bolted down the narrow trail, not caring where it led as long as it took us away from that thing. The forest seemed to shift around us as we ran, trees moving closer together to block our path, while roots rose up from the ground to trip us. Parker stumbled and fell hard onto his injured leg with a cry of pain. I stopped to help him up, but before I could reach him, one of the creature's vines shot out from the trees and wrapped around his arm. "Help me!" he screamed as it started pulling him back toward the shadows. I grabbed his other arm and pulled with everything I had, but the vine was too strong. It yanked him away from me like he weighed nothing at all. "Parker!" I shouted as he disappeared into the mist. His screams echoed through the forest for what felt like forever before they were suddenly cut off, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring into the darkness where he'd been taken. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my flashlight. And then I heard it again, that creaking noise mixed with rustling leaves, and realized I wasn't alone anymore. The creature stepped out of the shadows again, its glowing, core pulsing brighter now as if feeding off my fear. It didn't attack right away this time. Instead, it just stood there watching me like it was waiting for something, and then it spoke. Not in words exactly, it didn't have a mouth, but in vibrations that traveled through the ground and into my body like some kind of ancient frequency only living things could understand. It wasn't angry, not anymore, but curious, almost sad. I don't know how I understood what it was saying, because there weren't any words or images, just feelings and impressions that filled my mind all at once. It showed me visions of trees being cut down, thousands of them over centuries, leaving behind scars on the land where nothing would grow again. It showed me animals fleeing their homes as machines tore through their habitats without mercy or thought for what they were destroying. And then it showed me myself, standing in front of those massive old-growth trees years ago with an axe in my hands while they fell around me one by one like dominoes. I dropped to my knees under the weight of those images, the guilt crushing me like a physical force, until I could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," I whispered hoarsely, even though I wasn't sure if it could hear me or if it even cared about apologies at all. The creature tilted its head slightly as if considering my words, before stepping closer again, its massive form towering over me now as vines reached out toward my arms and legs slowly, almost gently this time, instead of violently like before. I didn't fight back. I couldn't, not after everything it had shown me about what we'd done to this place. To its place. I stayed on my knees, frozen in place as the creature loomed over me. Its vines crept closer, brushing against my arms and legs like they were testing me, trying to understand what I was. I could feel the rough texture of the bark-like tendrils against my skin, and for a moment I thought it was going to pull me into the forest, just like it had done with Parker. But it didn't. Instead, the glowing core in its chest pulsed brighter, and I felt something strange, a warmth spreading through my body that wasn't entirely unpleasant. It was like the forest itself was reaching out to me, not just physically, but mentally. Images flashed through my mind again, faster this time. Trees growing, animals thriving, rivers flowing clean and clear. It was showing me what this place used to be before we started tearing it apart. And then it showed me Tyler. He was alive, but barely. He was lying against the base of a massive tree, somewhere deeper in the forest. His body covered in bark-like growths that spread across his skin like a disease. His face was pale, his eyes half closed as he struggled to breathe. The vines around him weren't attacking. They were holding him in place, keeping him trapped but alive. "Let him go," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "Please." The creature tilted its head again, its hollow eyes narrowing slightly, as if it was trying to decide whether or not I was worth listening to. The vines around me tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind me that I wasn't in control here. "I know what we've done," I continued, my voice growing steadier as I forced myself to meet its gaze. "I know we've hurt this forest, hurt you. But Tyler, he's just a kid. He doesn't deserve this." The creature didn't respond, not in words or images, but the warmth in my chest grew stronger, almost overwhelming now. It wasn't just showing me things anymore. It was communicating with me directly through feelings and sensations that were impossible to describe, but impossible to ignore. It wanted something from me. "What do you want?" I asked softly. "What can I do?" For a moment there was nothing but silence. And then it showed me. The images came faster than before, flashes of rituals performed by indigenous shamans centuries ago under the light of the moon. They were binding themselves to the forest, becoming part of it so they could protect it from harm. Their spirits lived on in the trees and plants around us, guiding this creature and everything else within its territory. It wanted me to do the same. I understood what it meant immediately. If I agreed to this, I wouldn't be human anymore. Not entirely. My body would change, my mind would change. I would become part of the forest, just like those shamans had done all those years ago. But if I didn't, Tyler would die. I looked up at the creature again, its glowing core pulsing steadily as it waited for my answer. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice as I thought about everything that had led me here. All the trees I'd cut down, all the damage I'd done without even realizing it at the time. Maybe this was how I could make up for it. "I'll do it," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever you want. Just let Tyler go." The creature didn't move for a long moment, long enough that I started to wonder if it had even heard me. But then its vines loosened their grip on my arms and legs and began retreating back into its body. The warmth in my chest grew stronger, until it felt like my entire body was on fire, not painful, but intense enough to make me gasp for air. My vision blurred as more images flooded my mind, trees growing taller and stronger than ever before, animals returning to their homes, rivers running clean again after decades of pollution, and then darkness. When I woke up, everything felt different. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, not because there were no sounds, but because I could hear everything. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the faint hum of insects buzzing nearby, even the slow creak of trees swaying gently in place. It all blended together into one harmonious symphony that filled my mind completely. The second thing I noticed was how connected I felt to the ground beneath me, to the trees around me, even to the air itself. It was like every part of this forest was an extension of my own body now. A living, breathing network that pulsed with life and energy. And then I remembered Tyler. I pushed myself up onto shaky legs and looked around frantically until I saw him lying nearby against one of the massive trees from my vision earlier. The bark-like growths on his skin were gone now, replaced by pale scars that looked almost like veins running across his arms and legs. But he was breathing steadily. "Again, Tyler," I said hoarsely as I stumbled toward him and dropped to my knees beside him. "Tyler, wake up." His eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment he just stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was. But then his expression softened into something between relief and confusion. "Dad?" he whispered weakly. "I'm here," I said quickly, tears streaming down my face as I pulled him into a tight hug. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." He didn't say anything else, just held on to me tightly like he was afraid letting go would make everything disappear. As we sat there, together under the towering trees that now felt more like home than ever before, I realized something important. This wasn't just about saving Tyler or even making up for my own mistakes. It was about protecting something bigger than either of us could ever fully understand. And now, it was my responsibility to do exactly that. Tyler was weak but alive. That was all that mattered to me as I held him close, feeling his chest rise and fall with each shaky breath. I didn't know how much time had passed since I'd made my choice, but the forest around us felt different, calmer somehow. The creature, the guardian, was gone. Or maybe it wasn't gone at all. Maybe it was still here, watching us through the trees, through the vines, through every living thing in this forest. I could feel its presence now, like a faint hum in the back of my mind, always there but never intrusive. I helped Tyler to his feet, wrapping his arm around my shoulder to support him as we started walking. The forest seemed to guide us this time, the trees parting just enough to show us a clear path back towards safety. The mist was lifting too, letting sunlight filter through the canopy in golden beams that felt warm against my skin. But something about that warmth was different now. I looked down at my hands as we walked and noticed the faintest green tint to my skin, like chlorophyll running through my veins instead of blood. My fingertips felt rougher too, almost like bark, and when I touched one of the nearby trees for balance, it felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. I could sense its roots deep in the earth, its branches stretching toward the sky. It wasn't just a tree anymore. It was part of me, and I was part of it. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, Elder Joseph was waiting for us. His face was calm but serious as he watched us approach, his eyes lingering on me like he already knew. "What had happened?" "You spoke to it," he said simply when we stopped in front of him. I nodded. "It didn't give me much of a choice." He studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. "You did what needed to be done." Tyler looked between us with confusion written all over his face. "What's going on? What did you do?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain something I barely understood myself. "I made a deal," I said finally, "to save you." His brow furrowed as he glanced at Elder Joseph for answers, but the old man just placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Your father has become something more than human now, something this forest needs." Tyler shook his head, clearly struggling to process everything that had happened. "This doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't have to," I said gently. "All that matters is that you're safe." He didn't respond right away, just stared at me like he was trying to figure out if I was still the same person he'd always known. And maybe I wasn't. Not entirely, but I hoped there was still enough of me left for him to recognize. In the days that followed, news of what happened spread quickly. Northwest Timber pulled out of the area entirely after hearing what little testimony Parker and Tyler could give about their experiences in the forest. Officially, it was written off as some kind of mass poisoning caused by exposure to toxic plants or fungi, something no one could prove, but everyone was willing to accept because it was easier than facing the truth. The logging permits were revoked indefinitely, and plans were put in place to protect this section of the forest permanently. It wasn't much compared to all the damage that had already been done over the years, but it was a start. As for me, well, things were different now. I stayed on as a park ranger, continuing my patrols through the forest like I always had. But everything felt more connected now. When I walked among the trees, I could feel their roots beneath my feet like an extension of my own body. When I touched their bark or leaves, they seemed to respond, not with words, but with feelings and impressions that only I could understand. My body continued to change too, slowly but surely. My skin grew tougher and more textured over time, almost like bark in some places. My hair started sprouting tiny green shoots that looked like leaves if you caught them in the right light. And when I cut myself accidentally while working one day, sap leaked out instead of blood. It should have scared me, but it didn't. This was who I was now, what I'd chosen to become. And for once in my life, it felt right. Tyler stayed with me for a while after everything happened, helping me around the cabin and trying to learn more about why I'd made the choices I did. We talked more during those weeks than we had in years, about his job as a logger, about my regrets from those days, about what it meant to truly care for something bigger than yourself. Eventually, he decided to leave logging behind too. Not because I asked him to, but because he wanted something different for himself after seeing what this forest really meant. "I think I get it now," he said one morning as we sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the treetops. "Why you gave up everything for this place." I smiled at him softly and said only one thing: "It's worth it." The last time I saw Elder Joseph before he returned to his village, he told me something that stuck with me ever since. "You're not alone," he said quietly, as we stood together at the edge of another old-growth section deep within Olympic National Forest. "There are others like you out there, in forests all over the world, guardians who've made sacrifices just like yours." I nodded slowly, but didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything else left to say. This forest is my home now, my responsibility, and whatever comes next, I'll be ready for it. As I sit here now under one of those ancient trees, with its roots tangled around my legs like an embrace, I can feel everything. The wind moving through its branches above me, the animals scurrying through its undergrowth. Below, even Tyler's footsteps far off in another part of this vast network we call home. And for once in my life, everything feels exactly as it should be. My name is Ethan Wolcott, and I'm a park ranger stationed in one of the most remote corners of the Superior National Forest near the Canadian border. I'm 42 years old, and if you'd asked me 10 years ago what I'd be doing now, I would have never guessed this. Back then, I was a Force Recon Marine, doing things I'm not proud of in places I'd rather forget. But life has a way of pushing you into places you never thought you'd go. After my time in the military, I needed peace, or at least distance from people. Something about the quiet of the forest felt like it could heal me. Or maybe I just wanted to disappear. Either way, here I am, living alone in a small ranger station surrounded by miles of trees, lakes, and silence. The station itself is nothing fancy. A log cabin with a tin roof that leaks during heavy rain. There's a radio for emergencies, though it works only half the time because of how isolated we are. The nearest town is 45 miles away, and backup. Well, if something goes wrong out here, you're on your own. I've been here for 4 years. Now, most days are uneventful, checking trails, helping lost hikers find their way back, or keeping an eye on wildlife. But something about this forest has always felt off. It's hard to explain. The trees seem older than they should be, twisted in ways that make no sense. Some areas are eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence that presses on your ears like a weight. Locals have their stories about this place. They talk about shadowy figures seen between the trees at dusk or strange sounds echoing through the valleys at night. Most people laugh it off as superstition, but after everything I've been through in my life, I've learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts tell me there's something here, something watching. I keep journals about odd things I've noticed. Claw marks on trees too high for any animal to reach, patches of ground where nothing grows, even strange tracks that appear out of nowhere and vanish just as suddenly. My colleagues think I'm paranoid. Ethan's just jumpy from his military days, they say, but I know what I've seen. The truth is, I don't sleep much anymore. When I do sleep, it's with the lights on. Shadows make me uneasy, not just because of what they hide, but because sometimes they seem to move when they shouldn't. 3 hunting parties have gone missing in this forest over the last 2 years. The official reports blame hypothermia or getting lost in the wilderness, but deep down, I know there's more to it than that. People don't just vanish without a trace. Not like this. The last thing my ex-wife said to me before she left was that I cared more about ghosts than people. Maybe she was right. But out here, ghosts, or whatever's lurking in these woods, feel more real than anything else. Tonight feels different somehow. The air is colder than it should be for spring, and there's a strange stillness outside my window. Even the wind seems afraid to move through the trees. I glance at my father's old silver compass sitting on the desk beside me. It doesn't point north anymore. It hasn't since he gave it to me before he passed away. But for some reason, I can't bring myself to get rid of it. As I sit there staring at it, the radio crackles to life. A rare occurrence this far out. And a voice comes through, shaky and panicked. "Ranger station. Anyone there? Please, we need help." My heart skips a beat as I grab the receiver and press it to my ear. "This is Ranger Woolcott," I say quickly. "What's your location?" There's static for a moment before the voice comes back. "Whispering Pine Lake. Something's out here watching us." The line goes dead before I can ask anything else. I grab my gear, a flashlight, emergency flares, and my rifle, and head for the door. Whatever's happening out there tonight, it feels like it's just beginning. Stepped out of the ranger station into the cold night air. The forest stretched endlessly before me, a maze of towering white pine trees and fog-covered lowlands. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in a dull grey light. It was eerily quiet, no chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel path. The Superior National Forest had always felt alive to me, but not in a comforting way. The trees seemed older than they should be, their trunks twisted and gnarled, like they'd been through centuries of storms. Some areas of the forest were downright strange, places where nothing grew, where even animals refused to go. I called them dead zones. They weren't marked on any map, but I knew where they were from years of patrolling these woods. Tonight, something felt different. The air was colder than it should be for spring, and there was a heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. I adjusted my rifle strap and checked my flashlight before heading toward Whispering Pine Lake. It was about 5 miles away, deep in one of the most isolated parts of the forest. As I walked, my mind wandered to the stories locals told about this place. They spoke of shadowy figures seen between the trees at dusk, or strange sounds echoing through the valleys at night. Most people laughed it off as superstition, but I wasn't so sure anymore. Over the years, I'd seen things that didn't make sense. Claw marks too high for any animal to reach, tracks that started and stopped in the middle of nowhere, patches of ground where nothing grew. The trail to Whispering Pine Lake was narrow and uneven, winding through dense groves of pine and cedar. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of unusual rock formations, natural archways carved by centuries of wind and rain. They were beautiful in their own way, but unsettling too. Something about them felt unnatural. As I got closer to the lake, a thick mist began to rise from the ground. It clung to my boots and swirled around my legs like it had a mind of its own. The temperature dropped even further, and frost began to form on the edges of leaves, despite it being May. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and glanced at my father's old silver compass hanging from my belt. It wasn't pointing north, hadn't for years. but I carried it anyway. It was one of the few things I had left from him after he passed away. The mist grew thicker as I approached the lake, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My flashlight beam cut through the fog like a knife, revealing patches of frozen ground and pools of icy water where there shouldn't have been any. Then I saw it, the campsite, or what was left of it. The tents were shredded, their fabric flapping weakly in the cold breeze. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, sleeping bags torn open, food containers overturned. There were no signs of people anywhere. I crouched down to examine the ground and noticed something strange. Large canine prints, leading away from the campsite. They were bigger than any wolf tracks I'd ever seen. And then they just stopped. No fading away into smaller prints or signs of turning back. Just gone, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. A sound behind me made me spin. Around, a faint rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart pounded as I raised my flashlight and rifle toward the noise. "Hello?" I called out cautiously. No response. I stepped closer to the bushes and found an 11-year-old girl huddled inside. A hollow log. Her clothes were torn, her face pale with fear. She looked up at me with wide eyes but didn't say a word. "It's okay," I said gently, lowering my rifle. "I'm here to help." She didn't move or speak, just stared at me like she wasn't sure if I was real or not. "Are you hurt?" I asked again. Finally, she shook her head but still didn't say anything. I pulled off my jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders before helping her out of the log. As she stepped into the light, from my flashlight, I noticed something odd about her jacket. It had black stains on it that smelled faintly of sulfur and rot. "What happened here?" I asked softly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but closed it again quickly, shaking her head violently. Before I could press further, something caught my eye, a shadow moving between the trees nearby. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe an animal passing by, but then I realized there was no visible source for it. The shadow moved unnaturally fast, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I froze for a moment before snapping out of it and grabbing my radio to call for help, but all I got was static. The girl tugged on my sleeve suddenly and pointed towards something behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but somehow it felt like we weren't alone anymore. The girl's small hand gripped my sleeve so tightly it hurt. She pointed again toward the trees behind me, her eyes wide with fear. I turned, slowly, shining my flashlight in the direction she was pointing. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but trees and swirling mist. "Is someone out there?" I whispered, more to myself than to her. She didn't answer. Her breathing was shallow and quick, like a cornered animal ready to bolt. I crouched down to her level, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "Hey," I said softly, "you're safe now, okay? My name's Ethan. I'm a park ranger. Can you tell me your name?" She hesitated for a moment before whispering, "Maya." Her voice was barely audible, but it was something. "Okay, Maya," I said gently. "Can you tell me what happened here? Where are your parents?" At the mention of her parents, tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head violently. "They're gone," she choked out. "Gone where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even though my stomach was twisting into knots. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the lake. I followed her gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. The lake was completely still, too still. There wasn't a single ripple on its surface, even though a light breeze was blowing through the trees. The water looked almost black under the cloudy sky, like an endless void. "What happened at the lake?" I pressed gently. Maya's lips trembled as she whispered two words that sent a shiver down my spine. "It took them." I frowned. "What took them?" She didn't respond. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and started sobbing quietly. I stood up and scanned the area again with my flashlight. The destroyed campsite, the strange tracks that led nowhere, the unnatural stillness of the lake. It all felt wrong, in a way I couldn't explain. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave Maya behind or ignore whatever had happened here. "All right," I said finally, trying to sound confident, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. "We're going to get out of here, Maya. I'll take you back to the ranger station where it's safe." She looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks and nodded hesitantly. I reached for my radio again, hoping against hope that it would work this time. "Ranger Woolcott to base," I said into the receiver. "I've got a situation at Whispering Pine Lake. One survivor found, possible missing persons, requesting immediate assistance." Static crackled in response, nothing else. Of course, I muttered under my breath. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and picked up Maya in one arm. She clung to me tightly, as if letting go would mean being swallowed by the darkness around us. As we started back toward the trail leading away from the lake, that feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Every step felt heavier than the last, like something unseen was pressing down on us from all sides. Then came the sound. It started as a low hum, so faint at first that I thought it was just in my head. But it grew louder with each passing second until it became an eerie droning noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, a mix of deep vibrations and high-pitched whines that made my ears ache. Maya stiffened in my arms and whispered frantically, "It's coming." "What's coming?" I asked urgently, but she just buried her face in my chest and refused to look up. The droning noise grew louder still until it felt like it was inside my skull. The trees around us seemed to blur and shift in the dim light of my flashlight, as if they were alive and moving on their own. And then, silence. The noise stopped so suddenly that it left a ringing in my ears. For a moment, everything was still. Again, too still. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees ahead of us. At first glance, it looked like a person, tall and thin, but something about its movements wasn't right. It moved too smoothly, gliding through the fog without making a sound or disturbing anything around it. I froze in place, gripping Maya tightly as she whimpered softly against my chest. The shadow stopped just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. It didn't move or make a sound, it just stood there watching us. Or at least I think it was watching us. It didn't have any discernible features, just an outline of darkness against the misty backdrop of the forest. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible, but years of training kept me rooted in place. Long enough to assess the situation. Slowly I raised my rifle and aimed it at the shadowy figure. "Stay back!" I shouted into the darkness. The figure didn't move or respond. It just stood there like it was waiting for something. And then it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next second it wasn't. No sound, no movement, just gone as if it had never been there at all. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. With Maya clinging tightly to me, I turned and started, running down the trail as fast as I could without tripping over roots or rocks in the dark. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't done with us yet. I didn't stop running until I could barely breathe. My legs burned, my chest felt like it was on fire, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. Maya clung to me like her life depended on it, her small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around us, like they were alive. I finally slowed down when I reached a small clearing. My flashlight flickered weakly, the batteries struggling to keep up. I set Maya down gently on a fallen log and knelt in front of her. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. She nodded but didn't say anything. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She kept glancing over my shoulder as if she expected something to jump out of the shadows at any moment. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The droning sound was gone, but the silence was even worse. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that made every hair on my body stand on end. "We're going to be okay," I said, more to reassure myself than her. "We just need to keep moving." Maya shook her head violently. "It's still here," she whispered. I froze. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the edge of the clearing where the trees were thickest. I followed her gaze but saw nothing, just shadows and fog. "There's nothing there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "You can't see it, but it can see you." A chill ran down my spine at her words. I didn't know what she meant, but the way she said it sent a wave of unease through me. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence. A low growl that seemed to come from everywhere, at once. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I stood up quickly and gripped my rifle tightly, aiming it toward the direction of the noise. "Maya," I said quietly, "stay behind me." She didn't argue. She crouched behind the log and hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes darting around nervously. The growl came again, closer this time. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep and guttural, almost like a rumble of thunder mixed with a hiss. My flashlight flickered again, casting strange shadows across the clearing. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no response, just the sound of something moving through the trees. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and then silence again. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my grip on the rifle, and then I saw it. At first, it looked like another shadow among the trees, tall and thin with long limbs that didn't seem quite right. But as it stepped closer into the edge of my flashlight beam, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was wrong. Its body was pitch black and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its limbs were too long for its body, bending at odd angles like a broken puppet. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless except for two glowing white eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. I froze in place, unable to move or even breathe. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human or animal or anything that should exist in this world. The creature tilted its head slightly as if studying me. Then it took a step forward, and another, until it was just outside the clearing. "Maya," I whispered without taking my eyes off the thing. "Run." She didn't move. "I can't," she whispered back, her voice trembling. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing and crouched low like a predator ready to pounce. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. I raised my rifle slowly and aimed at its center mass. My finger hovered over the trigger as I tried to steady my breathing. "Stay back," I shouted. The creature didn't flinch. It just stared at me with those unblinking eyes. I fired a shot into its chest and immediately regretted it. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the forest like a thunderclap, shattering the silence, but the creature didn't react at all. The bullet passed through its body as if it wasn't even there, and buried itself in a tree behind it. The creature stood up straight again and let out an ear-piercing screech that made me drop my rifle and cover my ears. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a mix of rage and pain and something else, something primal. Maya screamed behind me as the creature lunged forward into the clearing, but just before it reached us, it stopped abruptly, as if hitting an invisible wall. It let out another screech before retreating back into the shadows of the trees, and then everything went quiet again. I turned around quickly and grabbed Maya by the hand. "We need to go," I said urgently. She nodded silently and followed me as we ran back toward the trail leading away from Whispering Pine Lake. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done with us yet. We ran. I didn't look back, and I didn't let go of Maya's hand. The trail was uneven, the roots and rocks threatening to trip us with every step. But I didn't care. My only focus was getting as far away from that thing as possible. Maya struggled to keep up, her small legs barely able to match my pace. I slowed down just enough to keep her from falling, but kept moving. The flashlight in my hand flickered again, the beam growing weaker by the second. If it died, we'd be left in total darkness. "Are we safe?" Maya asked between gasps for air. I didn't answer. I couldn't lie to her, and the truth was, I didn't know. The forest around us felt alive, like it was watching, waiting. Every shadow seemed to shift and move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a small wooden bridge that crossed over a shallow creek. I stopped in the middle of it and turned around, my flashlight sweeping over the trail behind us. Nothing, just trees and fog. Maya tugged on my sleeve. "Why did it stop?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it can't leave the lake." She frowned but didn't say anything else. I took a deep breath and tried to think. We were still at least 3 miles from the ranger station, too far to risk running blindly through the woods in the dark. "If that thing was following us, we needed a plan, Maya," I said softly, kneeling down to her level. "Listen to me carefully. We're going to keep moving, but we need to stay quiet and stick together, okay? No matter what happens, don't let go of my hand." She nodded solemnly. I stood up and adjusted my rifle strap before taking her hand again. The creek's shallow water gurgled softly beneath the bridge. As we started walking again, it sounded oddly comforting in the oppressive silence of the forest. But that comfort didn't last long. As we made our way up a narrow incline on the trail, I heard it again, that low growl from before. It was faint at first, almost like a distant rumble of thunder, but it grew louder with each passing second. Maya froze in place, her grip on my hand tightening. "It's here," she whispered, turned around slowly, raising my flashlight and rifle toward the direction of the sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the trees behind us, and then I saw it, those glowing white eyes staring at us from the shadows. The creature was back, standing just at the edge of the trail about 50 feet away. It didn't move. It just stood there watching us like before. Its body seemed even darker than before, blending almost perfectly with the surrounding shadows, except for those piercing eyes. "Maya," I said quietly without looking away from it. "When I say run, you run as fast as you can back down this trail." She started to protest, but I cut her off. "No arguments," I said firmly. "Do you understand?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded reluctantly. I tightened my grip on the rifle and took a step forward, keeping myself between her and the creature. "Stay back!" I shouted at it again. The creature tilted its head slightly as if curious about me, but didn't move. I fired another shot, this time aiming for its legs. But just like before, the bullet passed through it without any effect. The creature let out that same ear-piercing screech from earlier, making both Maya and me cover our ears in pain. This time, though, it didn't stop there. The creature lunged forward with an unnatural speed that made my stomach drop. It closed half the distance between us in seconds before stopping abruptly just outside of arm's reach. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I'd realized. Its body seemed to ripple and shift like smoke caught in a breeze, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it crouched low like a predator ready to strike. I swung my flashlight at it out of sheer desperation, and to my surprise, it recoiled slightly from the light. That's when it hit me. It wasn't afraid of bullets or noise, but light seemed to bother it somehow. "Maya!" I shouted over my shoulder without taking my eyes off the creature. "Run toward that big rock up ahead. Go!" She hesitated for only a second before bolting down the trail toward a large boulder about 20 yards away. The creature started to move toward her instinctively, but I stepped into its path and shone my flashlight directly into its face. It let out another screech and backed away slightly, its glowing eyes narrowing as if in pain. Not so tough now, are you? I muttered under my breath, though my hands were still shaking uncontrollably. I kept the beam trained on it as I slowly backed away toward where Maya was waiting by the boulder. The creature paced back and forth just outside of the flashlight's reach, like an animal trying to find a way around a barrier. When I reached Maya's side, she grabbed onto me tightly again. "What do we do now?" she asked tearfully. I glanced down at her before looking back at the creature still pacing in front of us, and then up at the sky where faint streaks of dawn were beginning to break through the clouds. "We survive," I said simply. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The creature had retreated into the darkness, its glowing eyes disappearing among the trees as soon as the light began to spread. For the first time all night, I felt like we had a chance. Maya and I didn't stop moving until we reached a small clearing where the sunlight was stronger. I sat her down on a flat rock and crouched in front of her, my hands resting on my knees as I tried to catch my breath. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She nodded but didn't say anything. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling as she hugged her knees to her chest. I glanced around the clearing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The creature was gone, for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. "We need to keep moving," I said after a moment. "The ranger station isn't far from here. Once we get there, we'll be safe." Maya looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "What if it comes back?" I hesitated before answering. "It won't come into the light," I said finally. "As long as we stay in the sunlight, we'll be okay." She nodded again, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. And honestly, neither was I. We started walking again, sticking to open areas where the sunlight was strongest. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, but there was still an uneasiness in the air that I couldn't shake. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. When we finally reached the ranger station, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The small log cabin looked almost welcoming in the morning light, its tin roof glinting faintly in the sun. I unlocked the door and ushered Maya inside before bolting it shut behind us. "Sit tight," I told her as I grabbed a map from my desk and spread it out on the table. "I need to figure out what's going on." She sat down on a chair by the window and watched me silently as I pored over the map, tracing our route from Whispering Pine Lake with my finger. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. The destroyed campsite, the strange tracks that led nowhere, the creature's reaction to light. There had to be an explanation for all of this, something logical that made sense. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find one. "Do you know what that thing is?" Maya asked suddenly. I looked up at her and shook my head. "No," I admitted. "But whatever it is, it's not normal." She hesitated before speaking again. "My dad used to tell me stories about this forest," she said quietly. "He said there were things here that didn't belong, things that were older than people." I frowned. "What kind of things?" She shrugged. "He called them the Watchers. He said they lived in the shadows and only came out at night." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "Did he ever say how to stop them?" I asked. She shook her head. "He just said to stay in the light." I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples, trying to think. If what Maya's father said was true, if these things really were ancient creatures that thrived in darkness, then our best chance of survival was daylight. But what about tonight? What would happen when the sun went down again? I grabbed my father's old silver compass from my belt and stared at it for a moment. It still wasn't pointing north, hadn't for years, but something about it felt significant now in a way I couldn't explain. "Maya," I said slowly, holding up the compass for her to see. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" She shook her head, but leaned closer to examine it. "Why doesn't it work?" she asked curiously. "I don't know," I admitted. "It stopped working after my dad gave it to me." She frowned thoughtfully, but didn't say anything else. I set the compass down on the table and turned my attention back to the map. If these creatures, or watchers, or whatever they were tied to specific areas of the forest, like Whispering, Pine Lake, then maybe there was a way to avoid them altogether. But deep down, I knew that wasn't enough, not if they could follow us like they had last night. "We need more light," I muttered under my breath. "What do you mean?" Maya asked. I looked up at her and gestured toward the window where sunlight streamed through onto the floorboards. "If they're afraid of light," I explained, "then maybe we can use that against them." Her eyes widened slightly as she realized what I meant. "Like traps?" "Exactly," I said with a nod. "We can set up lights around the station, lanterns, flashlights, anything we have, and make it impossible for them to get close." She nodded eagerly. "I can help." I smiled faintly at her enthusiasm despite everything we'd been through. "All right," I said firmly, "let's get to work." For the next few hours, we scoured every corner of the ranger station for anything that could produce light. Lanterns, flashlights, candles, even an old floodlight that hadn't been used in years. We set them up around every window and doorframe, until the entire cabin was bathed in light from every angle. By midday, we were exhausted but satisfied with our work. "Do you think this will work?" Maya asked as she stood beside me by one of the windows. "I hope so," I said honestly, but even as I said it, something deep inside me whispered that this wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The hours passed slowly as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Maya and I sat by the window, watching the forest outside. The sunlight gave me a small sense of relief, but it didn't erase the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I knew this wasn't over. Night would come again, and when it did, so would they. Maya was quiet most of the afternoon. She sat cross-legged on the floor with a sketch pad she'd found in one of the drawers, doodling quietly while I worked on reinforcing the station. I'd pushed furniture against the doors and windows, double-checked every lock, and tested each light source we'd set up. The floodlight by the front door was old and temperamental, but it still worked. For now, as I finished securing the last window, Maya spoke up. "Do you think my mum and dad are still out there?" she asked softly. I froze for a moment before turning to face her. She was staring down at her sketch pad, her pencil hovering over the paper. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but if they are, we'll find them." She nodded, but didn't look up. "They were trying to protect me," she said after a moment. When it came for us." I crouched down beside her. "What happened?" I asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "We were camping by the lake," she began. "It was late, and I was in the tent with my mom while my dad was outside by the fire. Then we heard him scream." She paused, her hands trembling as she gripped the pencil tightly. "My mom told me to stay in the tent," she continued. "But I peeked out, and I saw it." Her voice cracked as tears welled up in her eyes. "It was dragging my dad into the woods," she whispered. "My mom ran after him, and then they were both gone." I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting at her words. "And then what?" I asked quietly. "I hid," she said simply. "I ran into the forest and found that log, and I stayed there until you found me." I placed a hand on her shoulder, unsure of what to say. There were no words that could make this better, no promises I could make that wouldn't feel hollow. "We'll get through this," I said finally. "I won't let anything happen to you." She looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks and nodded. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. Maya stayed close to me as we prepared for nightfall, helping where she could, but mostly just watching nervously as I worked. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, every light in the station was ready to go. As darkness fell, a heavy stillness settled over the forest outside. The wind died down completely, and even the faint rustling of leaves seemed to stop. It was like the entire world was holding its breath. I stood by the window with my rifle in hand, staring out into the blackness beyond the tree line. The floodlight illuminated a small patch of ground outside the front door, but beyond that, nothing. Maya sat on the couch behind me, clutching a blanket tightly around her shoulders. She hadn't said much since sunset, just sat there quietly, watching me with wide eyes. Then it started. At first, it was just a faint sound, like whispers carried on the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second until it became an eerie droning noise that made my ears ache. "They're here," Maya whispered from behind me. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I could feel them out there, watching us from just beyond the reach of the light. The first sign of movement came from the edge of the floodlight's beam. A shadow flickering between two trees like smoke caught in a breeze. Then another, and another, until there were dozens of them circling just outside our perimeter. "Maya," I said, without turning around, "stay away from the windows." She nodded quickly and moved to sit on the floor behind one of the chairs. The shadows grew bolder as time went on, creeping closer to where the light faded into darkness. Their movements were unnatural, jerky and fluid at the same time, and their glowing white eyes seemed to pierce straight through me. One of them stepped fully into view. A tall, thin figure with limbs that bent at impossible angles. It stopped, just at the edge of the floodlight's beam, and tilted its head as if studying me. I raised my rifle instinctively but didn't fire. What good would it do? Bullets couldn't hurt these things. I'd learned that much already. Instead, I grabbed one of the emergency flares from my belt and lit it with shaking hands. The bright red light flared to life, casting long shadows across the clearing outside. The creature recoiled slightly at first, but didn't retreat entirely. It just stood there watching me with those unblinking eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness. There was no response. Just more whispers carried on that eerie droning sound. Then something changed. The air grew colder suddenly, and a strange pressure built up around us like we were being squeezed from all sides. The lights inside flickered briefly before stabilizing again, but not before one of those things managed to slip closer to one of the windows. "Maya!" I shouted urgently as I grabbed her arm and pulled her away from where she'd been sitting too close to one of those creatures' glowing eyes staring through glass. The creature's glowing eyes stared through the window, unblinking and cold. Its face, or what should have been its face, was pressed close to the glass, and I could see its long, twisted limbs shifting in the faint light. Maya clung tightly to my arm, her breathing shallow and fast. "Stay behind me," I whispered, my voice shaking as I grabbed another emergency flare from my belt. The lights inside flickered again, and the shadows outside seemed to ripple and move closer. The creatures were testing us, probing for weaknesses in our defenses. I lit the flare quickly, the bright red light filling the room with an eerie glow. The creature at the window recoiled slightly, but didn't retreat completely. It tilted its head as if curious about the flare before sliding back into the darkness. "Outside, they're getting closer," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded grimly. "They're trying to scare us." She looked up at me with wide eyes. "It's working!" I forced a weak smile despite the fear clawing at my chest. "We'll be okay," I said, trying to sound confident even though I wasn't sure anymore. "As long as we stay in the light, they can't get to us." But even as I said it, I couldn't ignore the flickering floodlight outside or the faint hum coming from the old generator in the corner of the room. If we lost power, we'd be sitting ducks. I moved quickly to check each light source we'd set up around the cabin, lanterns, flashlights, candles, making sure everything was working properly. Maya followed me closely, clutching her blanket like it was a shield. As I tested one of the flashlights near the back door, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from outside. It was soft at first, like raindrops on wood, but it grew louder and more deliberate with each passing second. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned toward the door. "Maya," I said quietly without looking away from it. "Go sit by the couch." She hesitated for a moment before nodding and backing away slowly. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if something was knocking gently on the door. My grip tightened on the flare in my hand as I stepped closer to it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. There was no response, just more tapping. I reached for my rifle with my free hand and aimed it at the door. My finger hovered over the trigger as I waited for something, anything, to happen. And then... silence. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive stillness that made every hair on my body stand on end. For a moment, I thought maybe whatever was out there had given up. But then came a loud crash from one of the windows near Maya's couch. She screamed as glass shattered across the floor, and one of those creatures lunged halfway through the broken window frame. Its long limbs twisted unnaturally as it clawed at the air inside, its glowing eyes fixed on her. "Maya!" I shouted as I ran toward her, lighting another flare and tossing it toward the creature. The bright red light flared up instantly, forcing it to retreat back into the darkness outside with an ear-piercing screech. Maya scrambled away from the broken window and into my arms, shaking uncontrollably. "It almost got me," she cried. "I know," I said quickly, holding her tightly as I scanned the room for any other signs of movement. "But you're okay now." The lights flickered. Again, longer this time, and my stomach dropped. The generator was failing. I could hear it sputtering weakly in the corner, like it was struggling to keep up with our demand for power. "We need to fix that generator," I muttered under my breath. Maya looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. "What if they come back?" "They will," I said honestly, "but if we lose power, we won't have any light left to stop them." She nodded reluctantly, but didn't say anything else. I grabbed one of the lanterns from near the front door and handed it to her. "Hold this," I said firmly. "Stay here by the couch and don't move unless I tell you to." "What about you?" she asked nervously. "I'll be right back," I promised, before heading toward where the generator sat humming weakly in its corner. As soon as I opened its casing to check for problems, another loud crash came from one of the windows near me. And this time, they didn't stop at just breaking glass. 3 of those creatures lunged halfway into the room through different windows simultaneously, their long limbs clawing at furniture and walls as they screeched loudly enough to make my ears ache. Dropped what I was doing and grabbed another flare from my belt, the last one, and lit it quickly before tossing it toward them. The bright red light forced them back again temporarily, but not far enough to make me feel safe anymore. "Maya," I shouted urgently over my shoulder, "get ready to run." "Maya, now," I shouted, my voice cracking as the creatures clawed their way further into the cabin. She didn't hesitate this time. Clutching the lantern tightly to her chest, she bolted toward me, her small feet slipping slightly on the wooden floor. I grabbed her arm and pulled her behind me as one of the creatures lunged forward, its long, twisted limbs scraping against the floorboards. The flare in my hand was burning low now, the red light flickering weakly. The creatures seemed to sense it. They were growing bolder, inching closer with every second. Their glowing white eyes locked onto us, unblinking and cold. "We can't stay here," I muttered under my breath, my mind racing. The cabin was no longer safe. They'd breached our defenses, and it was only a matter of time before the lights failed completely. "Where do we go?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the back door. It led to a narrow trail that wound through the forest and eventually connected to an old fire lookout tower, about a mile away. If we could make it there, we'd have a better chance of holding them off, or at least surviving until daylight. "The fire tower," I said quickly. "We're going to the fire tower." Maya's eyes widened. "But it's dark outside." "No," I said firmly, "but we don't have a choice." She nodded reluctantly, gripping the lantern even tighter as I grabbed my rifle and slung it over my shoulder. I stuffed a flashlight into my pocket and took her hand. "Stay close to me," I said. "No matter what happens, don't let go." With one last glance at the creatures still clawing their way into the cabin, I threw open the back door and pulled Maya outside into the cold night air. The forest was pitch black except for the faint glow of the lantern in her hands and the flickering beam of my flashlight. We ran. The trail was narrow and uneven, twisting through dense clusters of trees that seemed to close in around us. The lantern's light cast long shadows on the ground, making it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches in the wind, set my nerves on edge. Behind us I could hear them, oncoming. The droning noise started again, low at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It seemed to echo through the trees, surrounding us on all sides. I glanced over my shoulder and saw them. Shadows moving between the trees, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like headlights. "Faster," I urged Maya, pulling her along as she struggled to keep up. "I'm trying," she cried, her voice shaking with fear. The trail began to slope upward as we neared the fire tower. My legs burned with every step, but I didn't slow down. The creatures were closing in. I could feel them getting closer with every passing second. Finally, we broke through the tree line and into a small clearing at the base of the fire tower. The structure loomed above us like a skeleton against the night sky, tall and narrow with a single staircase winding up to a small cabin at the top. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Maya toward the stairs as I turned to face our pursuers. The first creature burst into the clearing just as she started climbing. Its long limbs moved unnaturally fast as it lunged toward me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I raised my rifle and fired a shot, not because I thought it would hurt it, but because I needed to slow it down. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the clearing, momentarily startling it enough for me to grab another flare from my belt. The very last one, and light it. The red glow flared up instantly, forcing the creature to recoil with an ear-piercing screech. "Keep going!" I shouted over my shoulder as I backed toward the stairs. Maya was halfway up now, her small figure illuminated by the lanterns. Glow as she climbed as fast as she could. Another creature emerged from the trees just as I reached the base of the stairs. A second shadowy figure with limbs that bent at impossible angles. I swung the flare toward it wildly, forcing it back just long enough for me to start climbing after Maya. The wooden stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended quickly toward the safety of the cabin at the top. When we finally reached it, Maya threw open the door and stumbled inside while I slammed it shut behind us and bolted it tightly. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. "They're still out there," Maya whispered as she peered out one of the small windows. I nodded grimly. "I know." The creatures had gathered at the base of the tower. Now, dozens of them moving in eerie unison as they circled below us like predators stalking their prey. Their glowing eyes stared up at us unblinkingly, and that awful droning noise filled the air once again. "We're safe here," I said more to myself than to her. "They can't climb." But even as I said it, part of me wasn't so sure anymore. The fire tower swayed slightly in the wind, its old wooden beams creaking under the weight of time. Maya sat huddled in a corner of the small cabin at the top, clutching the lantern tightly to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fear as she stared out the window at the creatures circling below. I stood by the door, my rifle in hand, watching them too. They moved slowly, their glowing eyes never leaving us. The droning noise filled the air like a low hum, vibrating through the walls and floor. It was relentless, like they were trying to wear us down. "They're not leaving," Maya whispered. "No," I said quietly. The sun wouldn't rise for hours, and I wasn't sure if we could hold out that long. The lantern's fuel was running low, and my flashlight was already flickering weakly. The creatures seemed to sense it. They were patient, waiting for their moment. I paced the small cabin, my mind racing. There had to be a way out of this, a way to survive, but every option felt like a dead end. We were trapped. "Ethan," Maya said suddenly, her voice trembling. "What if they climb?" I stopped pacing and looked at her. "They haven't yet," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe they can't." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. I glanced down at my father's old silver compass hanging from my belt. It still wasn't pointing north, just spinning aimlessly like it always did. But something about it felt different now. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to it. I unclipped it from my belt and held it up to the light. The needle spun slowly before stopping, pointing directly at Maya. She noticed and frowned. "Why is it doing that?" "I don't know," I admitted. She hesitated before speaking again. "My dad used to say that compasses could act weird around them." "The creatures?" I asked. She nodded. "He said they mess with things like magnets or electricity." I stared at the compass for a moment longer before an idea began to form in my mind. A desperate, reckless idea that might be our only chance. "Maya," I said firmly, kneeling down in front of her, "I need you to trust me." She looked at me nervously but nodded. "I think this compass can lead us out of here," I explained. "If these things are messing with it, maybe it's pointing toward something else." "Something else?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Maybe safety," I said hopefully. "Or maybe where they came from." Her eyes widened in fear. "You want to follow it?" "It's our only option," I said honestly. "We can't stay here all night. They'll get us eventually." She hesitated, before nodding again. "Okay," she whispered. I stood up and took a deep breath before opening one of the small windows slightly. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and something rotten. The creatures below didn't react. They just kept circling like vultures waiting for their prey to fall. "We'll go down quietly," I said as I grabbed the lantern from her hands and adjusted its flame to make it brighter. "Stay close to me and don't make a sound." Maya nodded silently as I slung my rifle over my shoulder and clipped the compass back onto my belt. We climbed down the narrow staircase slowly and carefully, each step creaking loudly in the stillness of the night. My heart pounded in my chest as we reached the ground level and stepped into the clearing where the creatures were waiting. They didn't move, not at first. Their glowing eyes followed us as we stepped cautiously onto the trail leading away from the tower. I held up the lantern high above us, its light casting long shadows across the ground. The creatures hissed softly, but stayed just outside its glow, circling us like sharks around a sinking ship. The compass needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on a direction, northwest, and I followed it without hesitation. We moved, quickly but carefully through the forest, sticking close together as we navigated through dense clusters of trees and uneven terrain. The droning noise grew louder behind us as more creatures joined their ranks, but they still didn't attack. "They're following us," Maya whispered nervously. "I know," I said quietly. "Just keep moving." The compass led us deeper into the forest, farther away from any trails or landmarks I recognized, and into an area that felt wrong. The trees here were twisted and gnarled, like they'd been warped by centuries of storms or something worse. The air grew colder with each step we took, until frost began to form on the edges of leaves, despite it being springtime. Finally, we reached a small clearing where an old stone structure stood, a crumbling archway covered in moss and vines that seemed ancient beyond comprehension. The compass needle pointed directly at it, and then stopped spinning entirely for the first time in years. "What is this place?" Maya asked softly as she stared at the archway with wide eyes. "I don't know," I admitted truthfully, but deep down, I felt like we weren't supposed to be here. The droning noise grew deafening now as dozens of those creatures emerged from the shadows around us, forming a circle that closed in tighter with each passing second until there was nowhere left to run. "Maya," I said urgently as I handed her the lantern, "stay behind me." She nodded silently as I raised my rifle one last time, ready to make our final stand against whatever these things were. And then everything went dark. My name is William Harkness, but most folks around here just call me Bill. I'm a park ranger in the Adirondack Mountains, up in New York. It's a quiet life, or at least it's supposed to be. I took this job after coming back from Korea. Figured being out here, away from people, might help me forget some of the things I saw over there. Turns out you can't outrun your own mind. The Adirondacks are beautiful this time of year. Late autumn, when the mountains turn shades of red and gold that look like something out of a painting. The air smells like pine needles and damp earth, and the lakes are so still they look like mirrors. But there's something about this place that's heavy, like the forest is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I work out of a ranger station that's about as remote as it gets. It's just me, a radio that barely works half the time, and my horse, Thunder. He's a big black stallion with more sense than most people I know. We spend our days patrolling the trails, making sure hikers don't get lost and keeping an eye on the wildlife. It's lonely work, but I like it that way. The locals around here tell stories about these woods, old legends passed down from the indigenous tribes who've lived here for centuries. They talk about spirits, things that walk in winter when the hunger sets in. I never paid much attention to those stories, not until recently. See, things have been strange lately. The weather's been colder than it should be for this time of year. Snow came early, and it's been sticking around like it doesn't want to leave. The forest feels quieter too, like even the animals know something's wrong. Sometimes, when I'm out on patrol, I get this feeling like I'm being watched. But every time I turn around, there's nothing there. I'll be honest with you. I've got my own demons to deal with. Nightmares about Korea wake me up most nights in a cold sweat, and then there's the drinking. I keep a flask in my saddlebag for emergencies, though if you asked me what counts as an emergency these days, I couldn't tell you. My supervisor keeps threatening to fire me if I don't get my act together. But what does he know? He wasn't there when everything went to hell. There's a picture I carry with me everywhere, a photo of my ex-wife and our little girl. Haven't seen them in years now. My wife left after she got tired of dealing with my moods and my drinking. Can't say I blame her, but that picture, it reminds me that once upon a time I had something worth fighting for. Anyway, back to the woods. A few days ago, Tom Running Bear, one of the other rangers, stopped by the station to check on me. Tom's one of the few people around here who doesn't treat me like some washed-up war vet who drinks too much. He grew up hearing all those old stories about this place and believes every word of them. The hungry season's coming. He told me that day, his voice low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear him, even though we were alone. What's that supposed to mean? I asked him. You'll see, he said before heading back out into the snow. At first I thought he was just messing with me, trying to scare me or something, but now I'm not so sure. The first time I noticed something was off, I was out on patrol with Thunder. It was early morning, and the frost on the ground sparkled like broken glass under the weak sunlight. We were riding through a stretch of old-growth pines, the kind that tower over you like ancient guardians. The air was so still, I could hear every creak of the saddle and every puff of Thunder's breath. That's when we found it, a deer carcass lying just off the trail. At first I thought it was a wolf kill. Happens all the time out here, but when I got closer, something didn't sit right. The deer's body was torn open, but none of the meat had been touched. Just the organs, heart, liver, lungs, all gone. It didn't make sense. Wolves don't waste a kill like that. Thunder snorted and shifted nervously, his ears flicking back and forth. Easy, boy, I said, patting his neck. But truth be told, I felt it too. That prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was standing just behind me. I scanned the trees but didn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. A few days later, things got stranger. I was back at the station one night, trying to fix myself some dinner. The radio crackled to life on the shelf behind me. It wasn't unusual. Sometimes we'd pick up chatter from other rangers, or even hunters in the area. But this time it wasn't voices I recognized. At first, it sounded like static, but then I heard it, whispering, faint and garbled, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I leaned closer, trying to make out what they were saying, but the words didn't make any sense. And then I heard my name. Bill. I froze. The voice was soft and low, almost familiar, but not quite. My stomach turned as a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Bill, it said again, dragging out the word like whoever or whatever. It was enjoyed saying it. I grabbed the radio and turned it off. The room fell silent except for the sound of my own breathing. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, or maybe just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I went out on patrol again, things only got worse. Thunder started acting strange, spooking at shadows that weren't there and refusing to go down certain trails we'd ridden 100 times before. At one point, he stopped dead in his tracks and wouldn't move no matter how much I urged him forward. His ears were pinned back and his whole body trembled like he'd seen a ghost. Fine, I muttered, turning him around. You win. That's when I saw them, footprints in the snow just off the trail. They were long and narrow, way too big to be human, but shaped like bare feet with clawed toes at the end. My heart thudded in my chest as I dismounted to get a closer look. The prints led deeper into the woods before disappearing into a patch of untouched snow. It didn't make any sense. There were no other tracks leading away from them. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a bear, or maybe even a moose. But deep down, I knew better. That night at the station, things got even more unsettling. Around midnight, I woke up to a scratching sound outside my cabin window. It wasn't loud, just faint enough to make me wonder if I'd imagined it. But when it didn't stop after a few minutes, I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. Snow outside was untouched, no tracks leading up to the window or anywhere near it. But as I stood there in the freezing cold, with my breath puffing out in front of me like smoke, I swear I felt eyes watching me from somewhere in the dark. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day brought more reports from locals, hunters, claiming they'd seen something tall and thin watching them from the tree line. Strange fires appearing and disappearing without explanation, animals going missing without a trace, and then there were the voices. People started saying they'd heard loved ones calling their names from deep in the woods, even though those loved ones were miles away or long dead. By now, even Thunder seemed on edge all the time, his ears constantly swiveling as if he could hear things that I couldn't. I tried to tell myself there had to be a logical explanation for all of this. That maybe it was just an early winter messing with everyone's heads, or some kind of mass hysteria spreading through town. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was out there in those woods, watching, waiting. A few days after Tom's visit, the call came in. A hunting party, 5 men from a nearby town, had gone missing up near Devil's Hollow. They'd been out there for 2 days, and no one had heard from them. Their families were worried sick. My supervisor radioed me, told me to organize a search and rescue. I didn't have much choice. It was my job, after all. I saddled up Thunder and met up with 3 of the junior rangers, Martinez, Peterson, and Collins. They were good guys, young and eager, but they didn't have much experience in the deep woods. I told them to stick close and follow my lead. We headed out just before dawn. The air was bitterly cold, and the snow crunched under our boots as we made our way into the forest. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of our breathing and the occasional snort from thunder. By midday, we reached the area where the hunters were last seen. It didn't take long to find their camp, or what was left of it. The tents were still standing, but they were torn open like something had ripped through them. There was food scattered everywhere, half-eaten sandwiches, cans of beans spilled in the snow, and blood, a lot of blood. Martinez knelt down by one of the tents, his face pale. "What? What did this?" he asked. I didn't answer because I didn't know. There were trails of blood leading away from the camp in different directions, like the men had scattered in a panic. Whatever happened here wasn't good. We followed one of the blood trails for about an hour before we found him. Raymond Foster, one of the hunters. He was alive, barely. His hands and feet were frostbitten, his lips cracked and blue. He was shaking so hard he could barely speak. "Raymond," I said as I knelt beside him. "It's Bill Harkness. You're safe now." His eyes darted around wildly, like he thought something was still chasing him. "It's not gone," he whispered. "What's not gone?" I asked. "The thing," he said, his voice trembling. It wears voices like clothes." I didn't understand what he meant at first, but before I could ask more, Martinez called out from a few feet away. "Do you hear that?" he said. "Hear what?" I asked. "Someone's calling my name," Martinez said, looking into the trees. I didn't hear anything except the wind, but Martinez swore up and down that someone was out there. "It sounds like my mom," he said, his voice shaky. "Stay with the group," I told him firmly. But Martinez didn't listen. Before any of us could stop him, he took off into the woods. "Martinez!" I shouted after him. "Get back here!" We chased after him as fast as we could, but it was like he'd vanished into thin air. Then we heard it, a scream that made my blood run cold. It was Martinez's voice, calling for help. "Please, help me!" he screamed over and over again. We followed the sound until we came to a clearing, but there was no sign of Martinez. Just a trail of blood leading deeper into the woods, and something else too, strange marks on the trees, like claw marks, but longer and deeper than anything I'd ever seen before. Peterson looked at me with wide eyes. What is this?" he asked. I didn't have an answer for him, because nothing about this made sense anymore. That night, we made camp with Raymond Foster, huddled by the fire for warmth. He barely spoke, except to mutter about the thing that had attacked them. "It started with animal sounds," he said quietly as we sat around the fire. "Like wolves or owls, but wrong somehow." "What do you mean, wrong?" Collins asked. "They didn't sound real," Foster said. "And then it started using our voices." The fire crackled as his words hung in the air like a bad omen. That night was the longest of my life. The fire crackled weakly, barely keeping the cold at bay. The wind howled through the trees, and every now and then I thought I heard something else, a faint whisper just on the edge of hearing. Foster sat close to the fire, trembling and staring into the flames like they were the only thing keeping him alive. Peterson was on watch while Collins and I tried to get some rest. It wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Martinez's face, or what I imagined it looked like now. I kept telling myself we'd find him in the morning, that he was just lost and scared, but deep down, I knew better. "Bill," a voice whispered. My eyes snapped open. It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but I knew what I'd heard. "Bill, help me." It was my daughter's voice. I sat up straight, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't make sense. She was hundreds of miles away, safe with her mom. But there it was again, clearer this time. "Daddy, please." I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and snow. "What is it?" Collins asked, sitting up from his sleeping bag. "I thought I heard something," I said, my voice shaky, Before he could respond, Peterson let out a yell from his spot on watch. We all jumped to our feet as he came stumbling back toward the fire, his face pale as a ghost. "It's out there," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw it." "Saw what?" I asked. He pointed into the darkness. Something tall. Too tall to be a man. It was watching me. I grabbed my rifle and stepped toward the edge of the campfire's glow. My hands were shaking as I aimed into the trees, but all I saw were shadows dancing in the flickering light. And then it moved. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a branch swaying in the wind or something. But no, it was real. A figure impossibly tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. Its limbs were too long, its body stretched like it didn't belong in this world. Its eyes glowed faintly blue in the darkness. "Back to the fire!" I shouted, my voice breaking as fear clawed at my throat. We huddled together around the flames as it stepped closer. Light revealed more of it. A skeletal frame, covered in pale, almost translucent skin that clung to its bones like wet paper. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth that looked like they could tear through anything. But it wasn't just how it looked, it was how it moved. One moment it was standing still, the next it seemed to glide between trees without making a sound. It didn't walk, it just appeared closer every time you blinked, and then it spoke. "Help me," it said in Martinez's voice. Collins let out a strangled cry and raised his rifle to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, it vanished into the shadows like smoke caught in a gust of wind. What is that thing?" Peterson stammered. Foster finally spoke up from where he sat by the fire, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a Wendigo," he said, "a spirit of hunger. I'd heard stories about Wendigos before, old legends about people who turned into monsters when they gave in to cannibalism during harsh winters. But I never believed any of it. Not until now. It uses voices to lure you," Foster continued. "Once you hear it, you're marked." The fire crackled loudly as his words sank in. The fire was the only thing keeping us together that night. None of us dared move too far from it. Foster's words stuck in my head. "Once you hear it, you're marked." I didn't know if I believed him, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't about to take any chances. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. Snow swirled around us, and the temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on our gear. It felt like the cold was alive, creeping into my bones no matter how close I got to the fire. Then we heard it again. "Help me." It was Martinez's voice calling out from somewhere in the woods. Peterson stood up, his face pale as a sheet. "That's him, he's alive," he said, grabbing his rifle. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm. "It's not him." "How do you know?" Peterson snapped. "What if he's hurt? What if he needs us?" "It's not him," Foster said quietly from his spot by the fire. "It's it." Peterson hesitated, looking between me and the darkness beyond the firelight. Then we heard another voice. This time, it was Collins's wife. "Tommy, come home," the voice called softly. Collins froze, his eyes wide. "That's her," he whispered. "That's my wife." "It's not real," I shouted, but it was too late. Collins bolted into the woods before I could stop him. The rest of us stood there, listening to his footsteps crunching through the snow until they faded into silence, and then came the scream. It was Collins's voice, but it didn't sound human anymore. It was twisted, stretched out like a recording played at the wrong speed. The sound made my stomach turn. "We have to get out of here," Peterson said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay." Before I could respond, something slammed into Peterson from behind and dragged him into the darkness. He didn't even have time to scream, just a muffled grunt and then silence. I grabbed my rifle and spun around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and snow. "It's playing with us," Foster said quietly. "It wants us scared." Well, it's doing a damn good job, I muttered under my breath. Foster looked at me with hollow eyes. You can't fight it, he said. Not like this. What do you mean? I asked. There's only one way to kill it, he said. Fire and silver. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Fire and silver? What kind of fairy tale nonsense was this? But then I remembered something. My flask. It was silver-plated, a gift from my ex-wife back when things were still good between us. And then there was the flamethrower back at the ranger station, a relic from my time in Korea that I'd kept for reasons even I couldn't explain. We need to get back to the station, I said. Foster shook his head. You won't make it, he said. Not with that thing out there. We don't have a choice, I said firmly. Foster looked at me for a long moment before nodding. I'll distract it, he said. What? No, I said. You'll die. I'm already dead, he said quietly, holding up his frostbitten hands. It marked me days ago. There's no saving me. Before I could stop him, Foster stood up and walked into the darkness without another word. I don't know how long I waited after that. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But eventually, the screams started again. Foster's voice echoed through the forest, drawing the creature away from our camp. I didn't waste any time. Grabbing what little gear I had left, I climbed onto Thunder and rode as fast as I could back toward the ranger station. The blizzard hit hard as we rode through the trees. Snow whipped at my face, and Thunder struggled to keep moving through the drifts. Every now and then, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, blue eyes watching me from between the trees, but I didn't stop. When we finally reached the station, I jumped off Thunder and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the flamethrower from its spot in the corner and checked to make sure it still worked. Then came the scratching at the door. At first it was faint, just a soft scrape of claws against wood. But then it grew louder, more insistent. Bill, a voice whispered from outside. It sounded like my daughter again. Daddy, let me in. I gritted my teeth and aimed the flamethrower at the door as it burst open with a crash. The Wendigo stood there in all its horrifying glory, tall and skeletal, with glowing blue eyes and jagged teeth that seemed to grin at me as if mocking my fear. I didn't give it a chance to move. Pulling the trigger on the flamethrower, I sent a jet of fire straight at it. The creature let out an unearthly scream, a sound like dozens of voices crying out in pain all at once, as flames engulfed its body. But it wasn't enough. The Wendigo lunged at me through the fire, its claws raking across my arm as I stumbled backward. My hand brushed against my flask, the silver flask, and without thinking, I threw it at the creature with everything I had. The flask hit its chest and sizzled on contact like acid burning through flesh. The Wendigo let out another scream before collapsing onto the floor in a heap of ash and smoke. I collapsed too, barely able to breathe as exhaustion and pain took over. When I woke up, the fire had burned out and the room was freezing cold. My left hand was numb, and when I looked down, I realized why. Frostbite. The Wendigo's claws had torn through my jacket and gloves, and the cold had done the rest. My fingers were blackened, stiff as wood. I knew I'd lose them. The station was quiet now, too quiet. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint crackle of ash where the Wendigo had fallen. There wasn't much left of it, just a pile of charred bones and soot on the floor. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I stumbled to the radio, hoping against hope that it still worked. My hands shook as I turned the dials, trying to find a signal through the static. "This is Ranger Harkness," I said into the mic, my voice hoarse. "I need help. Anyone out there?" For what felt like forever, there was nothing but static. Then finally, a voice came through, faint but clear enough to understand. "Ranger Harkness, this is Base. What's your status?" Relief washed over me like a wave. "I'm injured," I said. "Blizzard's bad. Need evac." "Hang tight," the voice said. "We're sending a team." I dropped the mic and slumped against the wall. my body aching from head to toe. Help was coming, but I didn't know if I'd make it until then. The hours dragged by as I waited. The blizzard raged outside, snow piling up against the windows until it felt like I was buried alive. Every now and then, I thought I heard whispers in the wind, faint voices calling my name, but I told myself it was just my imagination. When the rescue team finally arrived 2 days later, they found me half frozen and barely conscious. They bundled me into a sled and hauled me out of there while Thunder followed close behind, his breath steaming in the icy air. I don't remember much about the trip back to town or the hospital stay that followed. They told me later that I'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite and nearly died from exposure. But none of that mattered to me, not after what I'd seen. The doctor said it was trauma, that my mind had made up stories to cope with the stress of being stranded in a blizzard. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear the voices or feel that thing's claws tearing into them. After they discharged me from the hospital, I went back to my cabin near the station. Not because I wanted to, but because something inside me needed answers. I started reading everything I could find about Wendigos, old legends, survivor accounts, anything that might explain what happened out there. Tom Running Bear came by one day while I was packing up my things. "You survived," he said simply. "Barely," I replied. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. "You know it's not over," he said after a long pause. "What do you mean?" I asked. "The Wendigo doesn't just go away," he said quietly. "Once it marks you, it never really leaves." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded and went back to packing. That night, as I sat by the fire in my cabin, I thought about everything that had happened. The voices, the footprints, Foster's sacrifice, Collins and Peterson, Martinez, all gone because of that thing. I thought about my daughter too, the sound of her voice calling for me in the woods, even though she wasn't there. Was it really just a trick? Or was there something more to it? As the fire burned low and shadows crept across the walls, I noticed something strange on the window pane, a pattern forming in the frost. At first, it looked like random lines and swirls, but then it became clear: antlers. I stared at it for what felt like hours before finally grabbing my bag and heading for the door. As much as part of me wanted to stay and fight whatever might come next, another part of me knew better. Some things aren't meant to be fought, not by people like me anyway. Now, wherever I go, I carry 2 things with me at all times: a lighter and silver bullets, in case that thing ever comes back. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that some monsters are real. My name is Victoria Marshall, but everyone calls me Vic. I'm 31, a park ranger, and the first woman to ever hold that title at Mount Rainier National Park. It's not an easy job, but I've never been one to back down from a challenge. Before this, I was an army medic in Vietnam, patching up soldiers in the middle of chaos. I guess you could say I've always been drawn to danger. Some people call it bravery. My ex-husband called it recklessness. Maybe it's a bit of both. Mount Rainier is breathtaking, alpine meadows full of wildflowers, towering pine trees that seem to touch the sky, and valleys so deep they look like they go on forever. But lately, something feels off. The summer, air is crisp and clear most days, yet thick fog keeps rolling in out of nowhere. It's not normal, not here, not this time of year. Even the weather monitoring equipment at my observation post can't explain it. I transferred here from Yosemite a few months ago, and I'm still learning the terrain. The ranger station sits at 5,000 feet above sea level, with a view that could make anyone believe in magic. But lately, that magic feels more like a warning. The wildlife seems normal, mountain goats grazing on rocky slopes, eagles soaring overhead, but there's this quietness, like the forest is holding its breath. I've been hearing strange reports from hikers, howling, echoing across the valleys during clear afternoons, fog that seems to follow them on trails, and even whispers in the wind when no one else is around. At first, I chalked it up to nerves or imagination. People get spooked in the wilderness sometimes, but then came the missing hikers. 5 college kids from the University of Washington were supposed to be hiking the Paradise Loop Trail, a popular path for beginners. They never came back. Their families reported them missing 2 days ago, and now it's up to me to figure out what happened. I organized a search team with 2 other rangers. Jackson, who's been here for years and knows every trail by heart, and Powell, who's newer but eager to prove himself. We're heading out at sunrise tomorrow to retrace their steps. Before bed tonight, I flipped through my field journal, a habit I picked up in Vietnam to keep my thoughts straight. I wrote down everything unusual about this place. The fog patterns, the electromagnetic interference messing with our radios, and even some old pictographs I found in nearby caves showing wolf-like figures standing upright. Thomas Longfeather, a local indigenous guide I've been working with, says they're ancient guardians of the mountain. He warned me not to disturb them. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits, or at least I didn't before coming here. But something about his words stuck with me. Shadow, my timberwolf hybrid, who's been my companion for years, curled up at my feet as I finished writing. He's been restless lately too, growling at empty spaces and pacing near windows when the fog rolls in. Tomorrow will be hard. I can feel it in my bones, but I've faced worse before. Whatever's out there, I'll find those kids, or figure out what happened to them. As I turned off the lamp and climbed into bed, Shadow let out a low growl toward the window where fog was starting to gather again. My stomach tightened as I whispered to myself, "It's just weather, right?" The next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise as we set out. The air was cool, and the fog clung to the ground like a thin gray blanket. Jackson led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Powell followed close behind, carrying a pack of supplies. I had my medical kit strapped to my side and Shadow trotting at my heels. His ears were perked up, alert to every sound. We started on the Paradise Loop Trail, where the students were last seen. It's an easy hike, wide paths, gentle slopes, nothing too dangerous. But as we walked deeper into the forest, the fog thickened. It wasn't normal fog. It moved strangely, swirling around our legs like it had a mind of its own. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Powell asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jackson snorted. "It's just your imagination. Fog messes with your head." I didn't say anything, but I felt it too, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like eyes were following us from somewhere in the trees. After about 2 hours of hiking, we found their campsite, or what was left of it. The tents were shredded, ripped apart from the inside out. Sleeping bags and backpacks were scattered everywhere, torn open like someone or something had been searching through them. There were claw marks on the ground, deep gouges in the dirt that didn't look like they came from any animal I'd ever seen. "What the hell did this?" Jackson muttered, crouching down to examine one of the marks. Powell pointed at something nearby. "Look at these tracks." The tracks were huge, at least 15 inches long, and they weren't normal animal prints. They looked canine at first glance, but some of them had a strange shape, like whatever made them had been walking on 2 legs part of the time. Shadow growled, low in his throat, his hackles rising as he sniffed the air. I put a hand on his back to calm him, but my own heart was racing. We kept searching the area and found more disturbing clues. A camera was lying half buried in the dirt near one of the tents. The film inside was still intact, so I pocketed it to develop later. We also found a journal belonging to one of the students, a girl named Emily. The entries started off normal, descriptions of their hike, jokes about how one of their friends kept tripping over roots. But then they got darker. She wrote about feeling like they were being followed, hearing strange howling at night, and seeing shadows moving in the fog. Her last entry sent chills down my spine. "They walk like men, but move like wolves." They're herding us somewhere." As I read those words aloud to Jackson and Powell, a cold wind blew through the trees, making the fog swirl around us even thicker than before. We followed a faint blood trail leading away from the campsite and into a dense part of the forest where no official trails existed. The trees grew closer together here, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers, blocking out what little sunlight there was. Eventually, we came to an opening in the trees where there was a cave entrance I'd never seen before, not on any map or during any of my patrols. The blood trail led straight inside. Jackson hesitated at the entrance. "This doesn't feel right," he said, gripping his rifle tighter. He wasn't wrong. It didn't feel right at all. The air coming from inside was cold and damp, and there was an odd smell, like wet fur mixed with something metallic. But we couldn't turn back now. Those kids were out there somewhere, or at least we hoped they were, and it was our job to find them. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I stepped into the cave with Shadow by my side. Jackson and Powell followed close behind. The darkness swallowed us whole. The cave was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, the beams bouncing off damp stone walls covered in moss. The air smelled worse the deeper we went, like something had been rotting in there for a long time. Shadow stayed close to me, his ears twitching at every little sound. I could feel his tension, and it only made mine worse. Jackson and Powell were quiet behind me, their footsteps echoing softly in the narrow tunnel. We didn't have to go far before we found something. At first, it looked like a pile of sticks arranged in some kind of pattern. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't sticks. They were bones. Animal bones, mostly, but some looked bigger, human-sized. "Jesus," Powell whispered, his voice shaking. "What is this?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. The bones were arranged in strange shapes, circles, spirals, even something that looked like a star. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, had put them there on purpose. Jackson muttered under his breath, "This isn't right. We should get out of here." But before we could decide what to do next, we heard it. A low growl coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. It wasn't Shadow. This sound was deeper, rougher, and it echoed off the walls like it was coming from everywhere at once. We froze, our flashlights darting around the cave as we tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. The growling stopped for a moment, replaced by a strange shuffling noise. Then came the howling, a long, mournful sound that made my stomach twist into knots. "Vic," Jackson said quietly, "we need to leave." I nodded, but before we could move, Powell stepped forward toward one of the tunnels branching off from the main chamber. "Wait," he said. "Do you hear that? It sounds like someone crying." I strained my ears and heard it too. A faint sound like sobbing coming from deeper inside. It could have been one of the missing kids, or it could have been something else entirely. "Powell, don't," I started to say, but he was already moving toward the sound. "Powell!" Jackson hissed after him, but it was no use. He disappeared into the tunnel with his flashlight bobbing ahead of him, and then the fog came. It rolled into the cave so fast it didn't make sense, thick and heavy, filling every corner until we couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. My flashlight barely made a dent in it. "Powell!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. There was no answer at first, just silence, and then his scream tore through the air. It was high-pitched and full of terror, and it cut off. So suddenly it made my blood run cold. "Powell!" Jackson yelled, running toward where we'd last seen him. I grabbed his arm to stop him. "Wait! We can't just run in blind." But before I could say anything else, something moved in the fog. Something big and fast. My flashlight caught a glimpse of fur and glowing amber eyes before it disappeared. Again, Shadow started barking wildly, his teeth bared as he lunged at empty air. Whatever was out there wasn't showing itself completely. It was playing with us. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly, pulling Jackson back toward the entrance. As we turned to leave, Another shape appeared in the fog, this one taller than any animal I'd ever seen. It stood upright like a man, but had the head of a wolf with sharp teeth glinting in our flashlight beams. Its fur seemed to shift and swirl like smoke around its body. Jackson froze beside me, his face pale as he whispered, What is that?" The creature let out a low growl that vibrated through my chest before stepping back into the fog and disappearing again. We didn't wait around to find out what it wanted. Grabbing Shadow's collar to keep him close, I pulled Jackson with me as we ran for the cave entrance as fast as we could. When we finally burst out into daylight again, gasping for air like we'd been underwater too long, I turned back toward the cave just in time to see something move inside. Something tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes watching us before retreating into darkness. That night at the ranger station, none of us could sleep. Powell was gone, dead, or worse, and whatever had taken him wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. Shadow wouldn't stop pacing by the windows, growling at nothing while fog gathered outside again. I sat at my desk, with Emily's journal open in front of me, and developed the film from her camera using our small darkroom setup. The photos were blurry but unmistakable, tall figures standing at the tree line with glowing eyes reflecting back at the lens. My hands shook as I looked at them because now I knew. Whatever those things were, they weren't human. That night the fog came in heavier than ever. It surrounded the ranger station like a living thing, pressing against the windows and walls. Shadow wouldn't stop growling, pacing back and forth near the door. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff, and I'd never seen him so agitated. Jackson was sitting at the table, his rifle resting across his lap. He hadn't said much since we got back from the cave. I could tell he was shaken. Powell's screams still echoed in both of our heads, but he was trying to keep it together. I was flipping through Emily's journal again, hoping to find something we'd missed. Her words felt like they were staring back at me. They walk like men, but move like wolves. They're herding us somewhere. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence. I grabbed it, hoping for backup or even just some normal human voice on the other end. "Hello, this is Ranger Marshall at Mount Rainier Station," I said quickly. "We need immediate assistance. Missing hikers, possible animal attack." Static hissed back at me, followed by something that made my blood run cold. A long, low howl. Jackson stood up fast, his chair scraping across the floor. "What was that?" Before I could answer, Shadow started barking wildly at the window nearest. To the door. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, but all I could see was fog swirling around like smoke caught in the wind. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate sound like claws dragging across wood. It wasn't just one spot. It was everywhere. At once, on the walls, on the roof, even under the floorboards. "They're here," Jackson whispered, gripping his rifle tighter. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. Whatever had taken Powell in that cave wasn't staying hidden anymore. It had followed us back here. Thomas Longfeather arrived just before midnight with an elder from his tribe, a man named Samuel, who carried a bundle of herbs and a look of a grim determination. "You've angered them," Samuel said as soon as he stepped inside. "The fog walkers don't forgive trespassers." "Fog walkers?" Jackson asked, his voice sharp with fear and confusion. Samuel nodded slowly. "They were once guardians of this mountain, protectors of balance and life, but when settlers came and spilled innocent blood on sacred ground, they became corrupted by rage and grief. Now they hunt in packs, feeding on fear and flesh." Glanced at Shadow, who had stopped barking but was still growling low in his throat. "How do we stop them?" Samuel shook his head sadly. "You don't stop them. You survive them. We barricaded ourselves in the fire watchtower, a tall structure built to withstand storms but not supernatural attacks. The fog climbed up after us like it had hands and claws of its own, wrapping around the tower until we couldn't see anything below. Shadow growled at every corner of the room, while Samuel performed a ritual with herbs and chants, meant to keep the creatures at bay. For a while it seemed to work. The scratching stopped, and the air felt lighter. But then we heard voices. At first they sounded familiar. Powell's voice calling out for help, then Jackson's wife asking him to come home. But we knew better than to believe them. The fog walkers were playing tricks now, using their ability to mimic human speech to lure us out. "They're testing you," Samuel said quietly as he continued chanting. The wind picked up outside, hurricane-force gusts that shook the tower, so hard I thought it might collapse. Lightning flashed across the sky unnaturally close to us, striking trees and sending sparks flying into the fog. Then came their leader, the alpha dogman. It stood just outside the window where Shadow had been growling moments before. 7 feet tall with fur that shifted like smoke and amber eyes that burned with intelligence and malice. Its face was scarred from old battles, giving it an even more terrifying appearance. The alpha didn't attack right away. It watched us through the glass with an eerie calmness before turning its attention to the tower's support cables below. "They're cutting us down," Jackson muttered as he aimed his rifle out the window. I grabbed his arm before he could fire. "Bullets won't stop them." Samuel nodded solemnly as he finished his ritual and stood up straight for what felt like a final time. "I'll draw them away," he said firmly. "No!" Thomas protested immediately, stepping forward to stop him. But Samuel shook his head with a sad smile. "This is my mountain and my responsibility." Before any of us could argue further, Samuel opened the door and stepped into the fog without hesitation. We watched helplessly as half of the pack followed him into the mist, his chants growing fainter until they disappeared completely. The alpha turned its attention back to us then, with fewer creatures but no less determination, and began clawing its way up toward us through sheer force. "We need to get out of here," I said urgently as Shadow barked furiously beside me. Jackson nodded grimly as we grabbed what little supplies we had left, including flares, and prepared for one last desperate escape into the forest below. The tower didn't hold. The alpha and its pack tore through the supports like they were made of twigs, and the whole structure collapsed in a deafening crash. Jackson and I barely managed to jump clear before it came down, landing hard on the forest floor. Shadow yelped as he hit the ground beside me, but he got up quickly, limping slightly as he growled at the fog that surrounded us. I couldn't see Jackson at first. My head was spinning, my ears ringing from the fall, but then I heard him coughing a few feet away. He was alive, but his rifle had been lost in the chaos. The fog was thicker than ever now, swirling around us like it was alive. Shapes moved in it, tall, shadowy figures with glowing eyes that flickered like candle flames. They weren't hiding anymore. They were closing in. "Stay close," I shouted to Jackson as I grabbed one of the flares from my pack and struck it. The bright red light cut through the fog, and for a moment the creatures hesitated. They didn't like fire, that much was clear, but it wouldn't keep them back for long. Shadow barked furiously as one of the dogmen lunged toward us, its claws swiping through the air inches from my face. I swung the flare at it, and it recoiled, with a snarl, disappearing back into the mist. "We need to move." Jackson yelled, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward higher ground. We scrambled up a rocky slope, the fog chasing after us like a living thing. The dogmen were herding us again, just like Emily had written in her journal. They wanted us to go somewhere, to their ritual site. When we reached the top of the slope, I saw it, a circle of stones arranged in a pattern that made my skin crawl. In the center were the remains of the missing hikers, what was left of them anyway. Their bodies had been torn apart, their organs arranged in strange shapes that matched the bone patterns we'd seen in the cave. Jackson froze beside me, his face pale as he stared at the grisly scene. What is this?" "It's a ritual," I said quietly, my voice shaking. "They're summoning something." The Alpha appeared then, stepping into the circle with slow, deliberate movements. It was even bigger up close, its fur swirling like smoke around its massive frame, its amber eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. Shadow growled and lunged at it without hesitation, his teeth sinking into its leg. The Alpha let out a furious roar and swiped at him with its claws, throwing him to the ground. "Shadow!" I screamed as I ran to him. He was hurt, bleeding badly, but he still tried to stand between me and the Alpha. He looked up at me with those loyal eyes one last time before collapsing at my feet. Tears blurred my vision as I knelt beside him, but there wasn't time to grieve. The Alpha was coming for me now. I grabbed another flare from my pack and lit it, holding it out in front of me like a shield. The Alpha hesitated for a moment before lunging forward anyway, its claws slicing through the air toward my face. I dodged just in time and swung the flare at its head, but it barely flinched. Fire wasn't enough to stop it, not this one. Then I remembered something Samuel had said before he left. They feed on fear and flesh, but they can be wounded by silver. Silver. My hand went to my chest, where my Vietnam medals hung on a chain around my neck. They were silver-plated, not pure silver, but maybe it would be enough. As the Alpha lunged again, I ripped the chain off my neck and wrapped it around my hand like brass knuckles. When it came close enough, I swung with everything I had, punching. It square in the jaw. The reaction was immediate. It let out a howl that shook the trees around us and stumbled backward like it had been burned. The silver worked. It hurt them, but I wasn't done yet. Using what little strength I had left, I grabbed one of my climbing axes from my pack and tied the chain around its blade. When the Alpha came at me again, its teeth bared and claws reaching, I swung hard and buried the blade deep into its chest. It let out another deafening howl before collapsing to its knees. Its glowing eyes dimmed as its body began to dissolve into mist right in front of me, but not before one last swipe of its claws caught me across my side, sending me tumbling backward off the cliff edge behind me. I hit the river below hard enough to knock all the air out of my lungs. The cold water dragged me downstream as I fought to stay conscious. My vision blurred as darkness closed in around me. When I woke up, I was lying on a riverbank. My body felt broken. Every muscle ached, and my side throbbed where the Alpha had clawed me. The sound of rushing water filled my ears, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. But the cold mud beneath my fingers told me it was real. I didn't know how long I'd been there, or how far the river had carried me. The last thing I remembered was falling, then nothing. Shadow's face flashed in my mind, and my chest tightened. He was gone. I'd lost him. I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my body, forcing me back down. That's when I heard voices, familiar ones calling my name. Vic. Over here. It was a search and rescue team. They found me miles downstream from where the fight had happened. Jackson must have made it out and sent them after me. They carried me back to the ranger station on a stretcher, asking questions I didn't have answers to. What happened? Where were the hikers? Where was Powell? All I could do was shake my head and mumble something about an animal attack. The official report said as much. Unknown predator attack. No mention of the dogmen, no mention of the fog that seemed alive, no mention of the Alpha dissolving into mist before my eyes. Even if I wanted to tell them the truth, who would believe me? I spent weeks in the hospital recovering from my injuries. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but it didn't feel that way. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Shadow's lifeless body or heard Powell's screams echoing in that cave. But it wasn't just nightmares that haunted me. There were other things too. Strange things. The first time it happened, I thought it was just my imagination. A thin layer of fog appeared in my hospital room one night, even though the windows were closed. It clung to the floor like smoke from a fire, swirling around my bed before disappearing as quickly as it came. Then there were the changes in me. My teeth felt sharper when I ran my tongue over them, and my fingernails had started to harden into something almost claw-like. At first, I thought it was some kind of infection from the Alpha's wound, but deep down, I knew better. The dogmen hadn't just hurt me. They'd marked me somehow, changed me. One night, when the fog outside was so thick it swallowed everything beyond the hospital window, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The doctors said I needed rest and therapy for PTSD, but they didn't understand what was really happening to me. I packed what little I had and left without telling anyone. The fog seemed to follow me as I walked out into the night, silent and heavy, wrapping around me like an old friend. I didn't know where I was going or what would happen next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in one place for long, not with whatever this was growing inside me. Before leaving town completely, I stopped by the ranger station one last time to pick up something important, a motion-triggered camera I'd set up near the cave before everything went wrong. When I developed the film later that night in a cheap motel room miles away from Mount Rainier, what I saw made my blood run cold all over again. The photos showed figures moving through the fog, tall and bipedal with glowing eyes that stared directly into the lens before dissolving into mist. In one of the final shots, there was something else too, a reflection of myself standing in the fog. But it wasn't quite me. My eyes were glowing amber. I don't know what's happening to me, or how much time I have left before whatever this is takes over completely, but one thing is certain. I can't go back to being who I was before. The dogmen didn't just take those hikers or Powell or Shadow. They took part of me too. And now they're inside me somehow. I've started mapping fog patterns across the Pacific Northwest from wherever I can find shelter, cheap motels, abandoned cabins, anywhere off-grid where no one will ask questions about why my nails look like claws or why fog seems to follow me everywhere I go. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and still, I catch myself staring into mirrors longer than normal, watching as my pupils narrow into slits or as faint wisps of mist curl around my shoulders like smoke. I don't know how much longer I can fight this, or if I even want to anymore. The last entry in my journal reads, "They walk like men, but move like wolves." Now, so do I. My name is Malcolm Reynolds. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a park ranger at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico. It's a breathtaking place, full of underground wonders, massive chambers, towering stalagmites, and formations that look like something out of a dream. But for me, it's also a nightmare. You see, I wasn't always a park ranger. Before this, I was a soldier in Vietnam. My job was, well, they called us tunnel rats. We crawled into those dark, narrow Viet Cong tunnels to clear them out. I don't need to tell you how dangerous that was. One wrong move and you'd be buried alive, or worse. I almost didn't make it out of one of those tunnels, and ever since then, I've had this thing. Claustrophobia. Small spaces make my chest tighten up like a vice. But here I am, working at one of the largest cave systems in the world. Go figure. I mostly stick to above-ground duties, trail maintenance, guiding tourists around the safer parts. Of the caves, the deeper sections, no thanks. That's where the real darkness lives. Not just the kind you can see with your eyes, but the kind you feel in your gut. A few weeks ago, something strange happened. During routine maintenance, one of our teams accidentally broke through into a new chamber, a part of the cave system no one had ever seen before. At first, it seemed like a big discovery. There were these ancient petroglyphs on the walls, drawings of tall, thin figures with long arms and legs. Creepy-looking things. But then the bats started acting weird. Entire colonies abandoned their roosts overnight. And at night, some of us started hearing this low humming sound coming from deep in the caves. It wasn't loud, but it made your bones vibrate if you stood still long enough. Things got worse when a geological research team went missing last week. 6 scientists had gone down to study the new chamber for 3 days. They were supposed to check in every evening by radio, but on their second night, nothing, just static. Then there was this garbled transmission, screaming, something scraping against stone, and silence. The park was in chaos after that. The higher-ups wanted answers, but didn't want to scare off tourists, so they kept it quiet and called for a recovery team. That's where I come in. I wasn't exactly thrilled about leading this mission. Crawling back into dark tunnels wasn't my idea of fun, not after everything I'd been through, but they didn't give me much choice. They said my experience made me the best man for the job, so here I am again, packing up my gear and trying not to think about what might be waiting for us down there. The recovery team was small, just me and 3 other rangers, Dawson, Ortiz, and Howard. Dawson was young and eager, probably too eager for his own good. Ortiz was sharp as a tack and had been working these caves longer than anyone else on staff. Howard, well, let's just say he wasn't thrilled about being here either. We geared up early in the morning and headed down into the caves before sunrise. As we descended deeper into the earth, leaving behind the safety of daylight and fresh air, that familiar tightness started building in my chest again. I told myself it was just another job. Find the missing team, bring them back if we could. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end well. The air grew colder as we went deeper into the caves. Our headlamps cut through the heavy darkness, but it felt like the shadows were pressing in on us from all sides. I kept my breathing steady, focusing on the crunch of our boots against the rocky floor. Every step echoed, bouncing off walls we couldn't see. Ortiz led the way, holding a map of the cave system. "We'll start at the base camp they set up near the new chamber," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If they're still alive, that's where they'd go back to." I didn't say anything. I was too busy trying to keep my nerves in check. My hands were already sweating inside my gloves. Dawson, on the other hand, couldn't stop talking. "Man, this is wild," he said, his voice a little too loud for comfort. "A whole new chamber. Imagine what's down here. Fossils, minerals, who knows, maybe even treasure." Howard shot him a glare. "Treasure? We're looking for 6 missing people, kid. Keep your head on straight." Dawson muttered an apology and fell quiet after that. I was grateful for the silence. It gave me time to think, or maybe that wasn't such a good thing after all. My mind kept drifting back to Vietnam, to those tunnels and the suffocating darkness. I shook my head and forced myself to focus on the present. After what felt like hours, we reached the base camp, or what was left of it. The tents were still there, but they'd been torn apart like something had ripped through them in a frenzy. Equipment was scattered everywhere, broken radios, overturned tables even, a few shattered flashlights. "What the hell happened here?" Howard muttered, kneeling to pick up a torn backpack. Ortiz pointed her flashlight at the ground. "Blood," she said quietly. I followed her beam of light and saw it. A dark stain smeared across the rocky floor, leading away from the camp and into one of the tunnels. My stomach turned at the sight of it. Dawson crouched down near one of the tables and picked up a notebook. "Looks like one of their journals," he said, flipping through it carefully. His face went pale as he read aloud. "Moving shadows, eyes in the walls. Something's watching us." He looked up at us, his voice shaking now. "What does that mean?" No one answered him. I didn't want to admit it out loud, but I felt it too. That creeping sensation that we weren't alone down here. As we followed the blood trail deeper into the tunnels, things only got stranger. We found more abandoned equipment, cameras with shattered lenses, notebooks with pages torn out, but no sign of the scientists themselves. Ortiz stopped suddenly and knelt by a pile of dirt and rock near one wall. "Look at this," she said, brushing away some of the debris to reveal a strange carving in the stone beneath it. A long-limbed figure with hollow eyes and arms stretched out like it was reaching for something. Or someone. Dawson took a step back, his voice barely above a whisper now. That's just like those petroglyphs they found in the new chamber. Ortiz nodded grimly, but didn't say anything else. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as we pressed on, following that awful trail deeper into the earth. Then we found Dawson, or what was left of him. He'd wandered ahead while we were examining another piece of equipment, just for a second. But when we caught up to him, he wasn't standing anymore. He was part of the wall. His body was fused halfway into solid rock, like he'd been swallowed by it mid-step. His eyes were open, darting around wildly in pure terror, but he couldn't move anything else, not even his mouth to scream. "Oh my God," Ortiz whispered, backing away slowly. Howard raised his rifle instinctively, though I wasn't sure what he thought he could shoot at. "We have to get him out." Dawson's voice cracked as he stepped forward. "No!" Howard barked back sharply before turning to me with wide eyes full of panic. "What now?" I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Dawson, alive, but trapped halfway in the rock like the cave itself had swallowed him. His eyes darted around frantically, pleading for help, but his body was completely still, fused into the stone. Ortiz was the first to snap out of it. "We have to do something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. She reached out to touch him, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't," I said, sharply. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "We can't just leave him like this." I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what to think. This wasn't natural. It couldn't be. People don't just merge with rock. Howard stepped forward, his rifle still raised. "He's suffering," he said quietly. "We can't leave him like this." "No," Ortiz snapped, standing between Howard and Dawson. "We don't even know what's happening to him. There has to be a way to save him." While they argued, I took a step closer to Dawson, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and terrified, and I could see tears streaming down his face. I wanted to help him, I really did, but how? What could we possibly do? Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like stone grinding against stone, coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. It was slow at first, almost rhythmic, but it was getting louder, closer. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, cutting through their argument. They fell silent, and we all listened. The sound was unmistakable now. Something was moving in the darkness ahead of us. Howard took a step back, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could answer, it appeared. At first, it looked like part of the wall was shifting, like the rock itself was alive. But then it stepped into the beam of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it clearly for the first time. A tall, thin figure with impossibly long limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer and change color to match its surroundings. It didn't have eyes, at least not that I could see, but its head tilted toward us like it could sense us anyway. Its movements were slow and deliberate as it stepped closer, its joints bending in ways that made my stomach turn. And then it opened its mouth, or what I thought was its mouth. The slit ran all the way down its torso, lined with rows of jagged crystalline teeth that glinted in the light. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Howard broke the silence. "Run!" he shouted, firing his rifle at the creature. The gunshots echoed through the tunnel, deafening in the confined space, but they didn't seem to hurt it at all. The bullets hit its body and just disappeared, like they were being absorbed into the rock. The creature lunged forward with impossible speed, its long arms reaching for Howard as he tried to reload. Before any of us could react, it grabbed him by the legs and dragged him toward a narrow crevice in the wall. "Help me!" Howard screamed, kicking and struggling as he disappeared inch by inch into the crack that was far too small for a human body. I grabbed Ortiz and pulled her back as Howard's screams were cut off abruptly, leaving only silence behind. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty space where Howard had been just moments ago. What just happened? Ortiz whispered finally. I shook my head slowly. I don't know, I admitted. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. Ortiz turned back toward Dawson, still frozen in place, and let out a shaky breath. We can't stay. Here, she said firmly, whatever that thing is, there might be more of them. She was right. As much as it killed me to leave Dawson behind like that, we didn't have a choice. We'll come back for him, I promised quietly as we started moving again, following another tunnel away from where we'd seen the creature, but deep down, I wasn't sure if we'd make it out ourselves. Ortiz and I moved as quickly as we could through the tunnels, our footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. Neither of us spoke. What could we even say? Howard was gone. Dawson was part of the wall, and something was hunting us. My hands were trembling and my chest felt tight, but I forced myself to keep going. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls seeming to close in around us. Every sound, every drip of water, every scrape of our boots felt like it was amplified 100 times. Ortiz kept glancing over her shoulder, her flashlight beam darting behind us. Do you think it's still following us? She whispered. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to lie to her, but I also didn't want to admit the truth. I had no idea. We just need to keep moving, I said finally, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We came to a fork in the tunnel, a split leading in 2 different directions. Ortiz stopped, shining her light down each path. Which way? She asked, her voice tight with fear. I hesitated, looking back and forth between the 2 options. Both paths disappeared into darkness, but something about the one on the left made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, like the air was heavier somehow. Right, I said quickly. We go right. Ortiz nodded and started down the tunnel without question. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my ears. The tunnel opened up into a massive chamber, a space so large that our flashlights couldn't reach the walls or ceiling. The air was thick and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach turn. And then I saw them, hundreds of them. They were hanging from the walls and ceiling like bats, their long limbs folded against their bodies. Their skin shimmered faintly in the light, blending perfectly with the stone around them. They weren't moving, at least not yet, but just looking at them made my knees go weak. Oh my God, Ortiz whispered, her voice barely audible. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the shadows of the tunnel before she could step any closer. Don't make a sound, I hissed. We crouched there for what felt like an eternity, watching the creatures as they hung there in eerie silence. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what we were seeing. They're hibernating, Ortiz whispered finally, her voice shaking. Hibernating, I repeated, glancing at her. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the creatures. It makes sense. If they've been down here for centuries, maybe longer, they'd need to conserve energy. I didn't respond. My eyes were drawn to something else on the far side of the chamber, a cluster of shapes embedded in the wall that didn't look like rock, human shapes. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move closer for a better look, keeping low and quiet as I crept along the edge of the chamber. When I got close enough to see them clearly, my stomach lurched. They were people, or at least they had been once. Their bodies were cocooned in some kind of mineral secretion that had hardened around them like stone. Their faces were visible through cracks in the surface, frozen in expressions of terror. One of them was still alive. It was one of the missing scientists, a woman with dark hair and hollow cheeks. Her eyes flicked toward me as I approached, wide with fear and pain. "Help!" she rasped weakly, her voice barely audible. Ortiz appeared beside me, her face pale as she stared at the woman. "What did they do to you?" she whispered. The woman's lips moved again, but no sound came out this time. Ortiz reached out to touch her shoulder gently, but before she could make contact, something shifted behind us. A low rumble that made the ground vibrate beneath our feet. I turned just in time to see one of the creatures drop from its perch on the ceiling, landing silently on all fours like a predator stalking its prey. "They're waking up," Ortiz breathed. Panic surged through me as more of them began to stir, slowly at first, then faster as they unfolded their long limbs and began climbing down from the walls. "We have to go," I said urgently, grabbing Ortiz's arm and pulling her back toward the tunnel we'd come from. But before we could reach it, another creature stepped into our path, its elongated body blocking our escape route completely. We were trapped. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature in front of us tilted its head, its skin shifting colors to blend perfectly with the stone around it. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it watching us, studying us. Behind it, more of them were waking up, their long limbs unfolding. As they climbed down from the walls like spiders, Ortiz gripped my arm tightly. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was how hopeless this felt. We were trapped in their territory, surrounded by creatures that could move through solid rock like it was water. And then I saw it. A faint flicker of light, reflecting off something metallic on the far side of the chamber. It was a canister of emergency explosives, left behind by the research team. "We blow the chamber," I said quickly, keeping my voice low. Ortiz's eyes widened. "Are you crazy? We'll bury ourselves alive." "It's the only way," I said firmly. "If we don't stop them here, they'll make it to the surface." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay. We moved slowly and carefully, staying low as we crept along the edge of the chamber toward the explosives. The creatures were still waking up, their movements slow and deliberate as they adjusted to being out of hibernation. I kept my flashlight off, relying on the faint glow from their shimmering skin to guide us. When we reached the canister, Ortiz knelt down and began inspecting it. "It's still intact," she whispered, "but we'll need to set a timer." "How long?" I asked, glancing nervously at the creatures as they began to move toward us, their elongated limbs bending in unnatural ways. 5 minutes, she said quickly. "That should give us enough time to get out, if we're fast." I nodded and kept watch as she worked, my hands shaking as I gripped my flashlight like a weapon. The creatures were getting closer now, their movements faster and more coordinated. One of them let out a low, bone-rattling hum that made my vision blur for a moment. "Hurry!" I urged Ortiz, my voice tight with panic. "I'm almost done," she said through gritted teeth. Then one of them lunged. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. Its long arm shot out toward Ortiz, but she ducked just in time, and the creature's claws scraped against the stone where she'd been kneeling. "Go!" I shouted, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her away from the canister. We ran toward one of the tunnels leading out of the chamber, but the creatures were faster. They moved through the walls and floor like ghosts, cutting off our escape at every turn. Ortiz stopped suddenly and shoved something into my hands. The detonator. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "You have to finish this," she said firmly, her eyes filled with determination. Before I could stop her, she turned and ran straight toward the creatures, her flashlight swinging wildly as she screamed to get their attention. "Ortiz!" I shouted after her, but it was too late. The creatures swarmed her instantly, their long limbs wrapping around her as they dragged her back toward the center of the chamber. I wanted to go after her, I really did. But I knew what she was doing. She was buying me time. With tears streaming down my face, I turned and ran as fast as I could down one of the tunnels leading away from the chamber. The ground shook beneath me as I sprinted through the darkness, counting down the seconds in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2. I hit the detonator. The explosion roared through the caves like thunder, knocking me off my feet and sending a wave of heat and dust rushing past me. The tunnel collapsed behind me in a deafening crash of stone and debris. For a moment, everything went silent. Then I heard it, a faint hum coming from somewhere deep below me, and I realized that even with the chamber destroyed, It wasn't over yet. I don't know how long I lay there in the dark, coughing and gasping for air. The explosion had knocked the wind out of me, and my whole body ached from the impact. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, but I was alive. Somehow, I was alive. Slowly, I pushed myself to my feet, using the wall for support. My flashlight was cracked but still working, its beam flickering as I shone it down the tunnel ahead. The way back was completely blocked. Tons of rock and debris had sealed off the chamber. Ortiz was gone. Howard was gone. Dawson... I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. There had to be another way out. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the cave system. My chest felt tight, not just from the dust, but from the claustrophobia clawing at the edges of my mind. Every step felt harder than the last, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. After what felt like hours, I heard it, the faint sound of running water. Hope flared in my chest as I followed the sound, stumbling through the darkness until I reached an underground river. The water was cold and clear, flowing through a narrow passage that seemed to lead upward. I didn't hesitate. I waded into the water, letting it guide me as I climbed through the twisting passageways. The walls were tight in some places, pressing against my shoulders and making it hard to breathe, but I kept going. The thought of those creatures waking up again pushed me forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A faint glimmer of light ahead. My heart leapt as I scrambled toward it, pulling myself up through a narrow opening and into the fresh air of the surface world. I collapsed on the ground outside the cave entrance, gasping for air as sunlight warmed my face. For a moment, all I could do was lie there and let the reality sink in. I'd made it out, but it wasn't over. The park officials didn't ask too many questions when I reported back. They accepted my story about a gas explosion causing a cave-in and declared the deeper sections of Carlsbad Caverns off-limits indefinitely due to safety concerns. They didn't want a scandal or panic on their hands, so they quietly sealed off every entrance to the new chamber. They didn't know what really happened down there, and honestly, I wasn't sure they'd believe me if I told them. The government put me in quarantine for cave fever, though it felt more like they were studying me than treating me. Doctors poked and prodded at me for weeks, running tests and asking questions about what I'd seen in the caves. At first, everything seemed normal, at least physically, but then things started to change. One night, during one of their routine checkups, something strange happened. They'd hooked me up to some kind of heart monitor while asking me about Ortiz's final moments, about how she sacrificed herself so I could escape. And suddenly, my chest tightened. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me as panic set in, but instead of freezing up like I always did during claustrophobic episodes, something snapped. I don't know how to explain it. It felt like my body wasn't entirely mine anymore. My hand reached out instinctively toward the wall beside me and passed right through it. When I pulled it back, my skin looked normal, no sign of whatever had just happened, but deep down, I knew something inside me had changed. The transformation never fully took hold, not like Ortiz had warned me about, but it didn't go away either. It's like whatever those creatures did to me is still dormant inside my body, waiting for something. I left Carlsbad not long after that, quit my job as a park ranger and disappeared off the grid entirely. The less people knew about what happened down there and about what's happening to me, the better. But even now, even after all this time, I can still feel them. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and still, I hear that low humming sound again, the same one we heard in those tunnels, and it feels like they're calling to me. I've spent years tracking reports of similar creatures in caves around the world, trying to piece together their history and understand what they're planning. But no matter how far I go or how much distance I put between myself and Carlsbad Caverns, they're always with me. And one day soon, they'll find a way back to the surface. for now, all I can do is watch and wait and pray that when that day comes, we'll be ready for them.